The way that it works is you sort of have this layer cake of people that are involved in the parking industry. So on the bottom layer of that cake, you have the real estate, the actual asset owner. The asset owner generally then hires the next layer of the cake, which is the property management or parking management company. And that company usually is hired to do pretty much everything day to day. They install the machines, they put in the system, they collect the payments, they do everything. And then in the last 20 years, there's been this software layer that's tried to come and like layer itself on top of that. So typically when that asset owner at the bottom is hiring a parking management company, that company doesn't build any technology themselves. And so they're buying a machine, a gate arm from one vendor, they're buying an app from a different vendor, they're buying their backend data analytics system, if it exists, from a different vendor. Most of these parking operators, every garage that they manage, they'll have a different system. So they'll have these 3 systems, these 5 systems in this parking garage, and these 5 other systems in this parking garage. And so it's like just this completely complex problem where they're just duct taping things together, and it winds up being a really bad experience for the user and also means a lot of inefficiencies in the way that it's operated, and you have no real data insights or anything like that.
In some cases, they actually make more money from ticketing and towing. How does that work?
There's certain lots that you pull into, and it's very obvious that that's actually not the business that they're in. And if you look at like the P&L of that location, you can find that out pretty quickly. What it comes down to is where they can make their most money. There's like this asymmetric information war happening between the owner and the operator. You're not on the same side of the table. You're absolutely on opposite sides of the table. When we started AirGarage, we really tried to think from the ground up, what are some of the things that are taken for granted in the industry, and like how can you rethink them from first principles? We have parking lots, the one that I think I mentioned in Charleston, very traditional operation, gate arms, attendant, local operator, nothing explicitly wrong with it, right? Except that the owner felt like the operator wasn't being proactive and data-driven and wasn't really technologically driven. And so we came in, we took over through dynamic pricing, increased the revenue at that lot by like 44% over the first 6 months.
Welcome to The Peel, where we explore the world's greatest startup stories. I'm your host, Novak, founder of Banana Capital, the venture capital firm that provides the best parking lot experience for our founders. Today, I'm excited to share my conversation with Jonathon Barkl, the co-founder and CEO of AirGarage, a full-stack parking management company that helps real estate owners increase their income. We start off with a crash course on how the $131 billion parking industry evolved to be so complicated and outdated, the 3 different types of business models of a parking lot, why most actually make more money on tickets and towing than parking, and the reason American cities dedicate up to 30% of surface area to parking. Jonathon's been building AirGarage with his co-founders Chelsea and Scott for over 7 years. And he takes us inside the early days, including their very first idea, Airbnb for parking, and why that didn't work, how getting scammed out of $6,000 early on led to changing their business model, all the sales lessons he learned doing door-to-door sales one summer in the Arizona heat, moving to San Francisco with no connections and raising a seed round led by Mike Maples at Floodgate, his fundraising strategy to raise a Series A from A16Z in 1 week, the importance of investor brand when hiring early employees, and why AirGarage's focus on marketing and customer experience helped them grow 12x the year coming out of COVID. AirGarage has raised roughly $50 million from Keith and Delian at Founders Fund, Mike at Floodgate, Sriram at A16Z, Ram Thin at Abstract, and prior guest of the show, Ryan Delk at Primer. I really enjoyed this talk diving into all things parking and the history of AirGarage, and I think you will too. Thanks to Jonathon for coming on the show. Now, let's jump in after a quick word from Secureframe. If you're starting a company and building a new product, the last thing you're probably thinking about is compliance, security, and privacy. That's where Secureframe comes in. Longtime listeners already know Secureframe is the automated compliance platform built by security experts. Thousands of your favorite startups like Angelus, Coda, and Ramp use Secureframe to get, stay, and automate their compliance with security and privacy frameworks like SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, GDPR, and many more. If you've ever tried getting compliant in any of these or other frameworks, you already know how hard and time-consuming it is. Secureframe streamlines all your compliance, which gives you more time to focus on actually growing your business. I'm an investor in Secureframe, and I recommend it to every founder I meet. Join hundreds of other listeners of the show and click the link in the description to get started on a demo with Secureframe's in-house team of compliance experts and former auditors. Thank you, Secureframe. And now let's talk to Jonathon Barkl about AirGarage. Jonathon, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. So can you really quick explain just what is AirGarage?
Yeah, AirGarage. So, we work with real estate owners and we manage and monetize their parking lots and parking garages for them. So basically, we take it from being just a piece of asphalt with stripes on it to a full-fledged parking operation that generates income and try to handle everything involved in that using our own technology. So all the advertising, the payment collection, the enforcement, like picking up trash, pretty much everything day to day to make it run and, make sure that the owner doesn't have to think about it and maximize their income.
And you're fairly hands off, or it's kind of like asset light capital? Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, well, so we're asset light in the sense that like we don't own any real estate. So like you can think about AirGarage as we're like basically a property management company, but a property management company that specifically focuses on parking lots instead of like apartment buildings or office buildings or anything like that. And where the thesis is basically that like, hey, a lot of the traditional things that you do to manage a parking lot, you don't have to do it that way. You know, you can do a lot of this with software and technology. You can automate the things that can and should be automated and not necessarily automate the things that can't and shouldn't be automated, like picking up trash and, you know, cleaning graffiti. Maybe someday in the future in 2050, you can do those things automatically. But like there's a lot of day-to-day stuff that you can't automate and you shouldn't. But we basically are like, hey, how do we do those things with technology? So we're like asset light in that sense, where it's like the traditional way of doing things is machines, gate arms, attendants, cash, all this sort of overhead that goes into managing a parking lot. But we're asset light in the sense that we don't own any of the real estate. We're a software business at the end of the day. And the goal is how do you drive as much revenue for the parking lot owner through that software?
So how does a parking lot business traditionally work in terms of how it's operated, what the margins look like, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis? Can you just kind of get us in the mindset and the headspace of like how parking lots work?
Yeah. There's so many details that go into it. And I think this is like a classic example of like schlep blindness, right? In the sense that like everybody you know has parked a car and or like had the experience of like parking your car sucks, right? You pull up to the machine, you try to get the ticket and like the button's too far out your window. And so you got to reach out you go open your door, unbuckle your belt, like get the ticket, all that sort of stuff. And then you get back to the machine and on your way out and like the ticket won't read or it won't take your credit card. Or I was just in a garage in San Francisco the other day near our office, and it's like my metal ramp card, plug for ramp here right now. It's like my metal ramp card goes in the machine and just gets eaten by the machine. I'm like, oh crap, what happened? And it's like, turns out there's this whole like big long paragraph sign. And in the middle of the paragraph, you know, that I didn't read because it's a whole paragraph and I'm trying to get somewhere. It's like, don't put metal cards in the machine, right? And so it's like just a very traditional sort of like, there's all these problems and the experience sucks. But I think what most drivers never think about is like, why does it suck? And like, why is it the way that it is? And really, I mean, you know, parking, it's a very traditional industry, right? Basically, the way that it works is you sort of have this layer cake of like people that are involved in the parking industry. So it's like on the bottom layer of that cake, you have like the real estate, the actual asset owner. And generally speaking, they either are a sort of small mom and pop owner, like, you know, your uncle bought a parking lot in 1970 and passed it down to you, or it's like a big institutional investor. And like they're buying more into parking lots as urbanization happens and things like that. But basically the asset owner generally then hires like the next layer of the cake, which is the property management or parking management company is generally what they're called, parking operator, parking management company. And that company usually is hired to do pretty much everything day to day. So basically the property manager, your apartment property manager, right? They install the machines, they put in the system, they collect the payments, they do everything. And then in the last 20 years, there's been sort of like this software layer that's tried to come and like layer itself on top of that. And there's all these software companies that have tried to change the parking industry because they've seen how terrible this parking experience is, right? And they're like software engineers and they're like, hey, we can build a better experience. And so let's sell software to the old school companies and that's how we'll distribute it and we'll fix this experience. But it's basically this like very convoluted, like there's a lot of different vendors and systems, like this whole stack of different vendors that are involved, each one taking a different piece of the pie, and all the different systems come from different vendors. So typically when that asset owner at the bottom is hiring a parking management company, that company doesn't build any technology themselves. And so they're buying a machine, a gate arm from one vendor, they're buying an app from a different vendor, they're buying their backend data analytics system, if it exists, from a different vendor. And then they're trying to like tie all of this together as like a non-technology company. And so it like winds up being this sort of mishmash system. And then you also wind up with the complexity of like most of these parking operators, every garage that they manage, they'll have a different system. So they'll have like these 3 systems, these 5 systems in this parking garage, and these 5 other systems in this parking garage. And so it's like just this completely complex problem where they're just duct taping things together and it winds up being a really bad experience for the user and also means like a lot of inefficiencies in the way that it's operated and you have no real data insights or anything like that.
Why would they be having different products at different lots?
Yeah, I think it's like a weird incentive problem in the industry of like, okay, I mean, if you think about like the most traditional way that it works, if like maybe an example is like a municipality or a city that owns a piece of real estate that they need managed. Usually what they will do, they're very traditional about this. So they'll put out like an RFP, a request for proposals, right? And they'll hire a vendor. But usually what the cities will do and why they're like specifically very difficult to change is that they'll put out a specific RFP that's like, hey, we want to buy gate machines, right? Like we want to buy the gate arms. And then after they've done that procurement process, 2 years later, they'll say, okay, now we want to buy an app because they now know that they need an app, right? And then 2 years after that, after they've already put in a new gate system and put in a new app, then they will run a new cycle of RFPs to get the parking management company. And so it's like inherently just by the way that they're running their process, they are choosing different vendors for each of those different things. And I think that that's just because like in the very beginning, you only had the parking management company. So it was like we hired them.
Yeah, there was no internet. There's no need to have all this other stuff.
Exactly. There was no internet. There was no gate machines. There was no parking machines, nothing like that. And so it's like you just hired the parking management company. And then I'm sure at some point, basically they came and they were like, hey, we should install gate arms because it'll automate things. And so then they started a new RFP cycle for the gate arms. And then eventually there was apps. And so then they started a new RFP cycle for the apps. And so like that's basically the most...
Credit card readers also introduced
the payment
20,
processing
30 years ago. Yeah,
exactly. And so it's like very like, that's the most traditional way of doing it. I think that like weirdly, a lot of parking management companies that have just been around for a long time have just gotten into that cycle of like, they're always looking for like the cheapest, fastest, bestest solution. That wasn't how I meant to say that, but that's fine. It gets the point across.
Yeah.
They don't build their own technology, so they're always looking to get the best price. And so when they're taking over a new parking garage, they're like, who's going to give me the cheapest and best machines? And so they're buying new every single time. Versus like with AirGarage, it's like we want the same system in every parking facility because then you reduce a lot of that complexity. So that's part of it is like, machines break down, different machines come from different vendors. All this sort of stuff is because of sort of the traditional model where they just don't build the technology in-house. And so they're always looking to procure from third-party vendors. And so they're always swapping between different vendors and they wind up with different systems in different places.
So I've heard you say this really interesting thing talking about business models of the parking operators. You have said in some cases, they actually make more money, not from parking, but from ticketing and towing. How does that work? Because that just sounds really messed up.
Yeah, no, it is definitely really messed up because, what winds up happening is if you're parking in a lot, you think that like they're in the business of making money on parking, right? It's pretty simple, but there's certain lots that you pull into and it's very obvious that that's actually not the business that they're in. And if you look at like the P&L of that location, like you can find that out pretty quickly. What it comes down to is like where they can make their most money. Typically, if the parking management company has like structured a deal with the parking lot, sometimes you'll see that they've like split the parking revenue one way and then they split the enforcement revenue a different way, right? So they'll be like, oh, we're going to pay the owner 90, 100% of the parking revenue, but then we're going to take 80% of the parking revenue or the enforcement revenue, right? And so then like, obviously, what do they want you to do? They want you to pay the enforcement revenue. Or like what we'll see is just the simple issue of like an owner that is sort of like self-managing their property. Usually they don't have a good solution to like actually do enforcement. And so what they'll do is they'll just partner with like a local towing company, right? Which seems great because like the local towing company, they already want to be towing cars. That's what they're in the business of doing. But the only way that they make money is by towing cars. And so then what do they really want to do? They want to tow cars. They don't want to be forgiving. They don't want to have great grace periods. They don't want to like, excuse you if you mistyped your license plate, anything like that. Even in a basic situation, right? Like when we started AirGarage, we really tried to think from the ground up, like what are some of the things that are taken for granted in the industry and like how can you rethink them from first principles? So a good example of this is like, if you're a loyal customer of a parking garage, which I don't know if anybody really identifies as a loyal customer of a parking garage, but like
I am.
In actuality, like you are because like you park there every day in a lot of cases, right? Imagine a situation in which you park in a parking garage every single day and you're a loyal customer and you pay every single day and you're a good actor and you're trying to do the right thing by the business, right? And then one random day you're in a rush and you forget to pay because you're late to your doctor's appointment and you run into the appointment without paying, right? What's going to happen? They're going to ticket or tow your car. And it's not necessarily because they think that you're a bad actor. It's just that they have no idea who you are, which is absurd because you're a loyal customer of theirs. You park there every day. Like, why should they not know who you are?
And they see the dollar signs. They're like, we got a $200 ticket here.
Exactly. And that's part of the problem is like, if you paid for your parking that day, they get $8, right? But if you didn't pay for your parking that day, they leave you a ticket and they get $50 or $100, or they tow your car and they get $200. So it's like a terrible economic incentive problem. And so like one of the things we did from the very beginning was think about like, okay, why are some of these things in the parking industry the way they are? It's kind of absurd. Why would they ticket or tow your car? You're a loyal customer. They should want you to come back and they should be treating you well, right? And like that's a pretty basic philosophy in business is if you have loyal customers, you treat them well so they keep coming back. And so when we started AirGarage, we're like, this is pretty absurd. Why don't they do this? It's because they have no memory of who you are. Because if you're just paying the parking machine, you're just swiping a credit card. They have no idea who you are. They have no idea what car you're associated with. And even if you have paid through like an app, usually the app doesn't actually like have a way to do this. But with AirGarage, if you're parked in one of our locations, we have your license plate on file, we have your credit card on file, we have your phone number on file, we have a profile for you. So if our enforcement team, the Space Force, if they go through the parking lot, scan your license plate, we see that you didn't pay for the day, we're not going to ticket or tow your car because that's a worse experience for you and a worse experience for us because now we have to call a tow truck, which sucks. We're just going to charge you for the day of parking because like, of course we should. We know who you are. You're a loyal customer. And we just text you and we're like, hey, we just saved you from being towed. You're welcome. That'll be $15 sort of thing.
That's some affinity.
People respond and they're like, that's That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I will come back to this AirGarage parking lot because they did not tow me.
You will never get towed in an AirGarage parking lot unless like you have a bad credit card and like, you won't get towed if you're a good actor, right? It's a very different experience.
I remember the way we connected on this was I parked in an AirGarage lot in Detroit at a restaurant. I'd like heard of AirGarage and I'd be like, oh, they must be in Arizona or San Francisco or whatever. Tried it. I parked and I was like, holy shit, this was the best parking experience I've ever had. I don't think I've ever been excited about a parking lot experience. I think partially I was excited because I'd like heard of it. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like I knew of this. I tried it and it like exceeded expectations. So I tweeted the picture like best parking experience ever. And I'm assuming people probably sent it to you or you saw it. And then that's why we're here. So in terms of just thinking about cities and how they are affected by parking, I don't know if people realize, like, can you just kind of talk about really how that impacts how a city is designed and operates? Because I think there's a lot more behind that than most people realize.
It kind of goes back to the schlep blindness of like parking is all around us every single day. And it's one of those weird things that we kind of take for granted as a society in the sense that like we expect parking to be like convenient and, close to our destination. And we also like basically expect it to be free, which is not really true of any other service that we have in our daily lives of like, hey, I expect this resource that I don't own to be available to me, convenient, and to be free. It's kind of this interesting mindset. And it's kind of like you have to ask yourself, like, how did we get there? There's some interesting statistics about parking in America. Like the average American city, about 30% of the real estate surface area in an average American city is dedicated to parking and basically transportation of vehicles, of parking.
So this is not the streets or the
not
roads,
the streets.
but
so
specifically...
there's a interesting map that I'll have to find and we can link in like the show notes. And somebody just put this out. And it's like, even if you just look at like the core downtown area, parking surface area, specifically for the parking, not for the streets, in like these core urban areas like Houston, Atlanta, Detroit, Phoenix, those kinds of metros, it's like 25, 30%, even in the densest part of the core. And then even if you look at like the more densely populated cities like, Los Angeles or Chicago, it's like 15-ish% of the downtown core urban area, just on a surface area ratio is like 15% parking. So it's like a ton of parking, right? And there's some statistic and basically that in the United States, it's estimated that there's about 8 parking spaces for every car in the United States. That's an estimate. They don't actually know the real amount because there's so many parking spaces. And yeah, I mean, a lot of those are made up by like Walmart parking lots with 10,000 spaces for their, 300,000 square foot store and stuff like that. But there's a lot of parking in America, right? And it's kind of like, why and how did it get that way? And like, it goes back, and it's this really fascinating thing in that, like, if you think about cities 100 years ago were so different from the cities we see today, right? If you just watch these like videos of like early 1900s, like Houston, it like looks like New York more than it looks like Houston today, where it's like really dense. There's streetcars everywhere. There's people walking around, horses, like mismatched traffic, all this sort of stuff. There's no parking lots, right? And we basically, I think, almost take it for granted today that like cities are the way that they are and like it's going to be that way forever. But like actually mostly cities were like very dynamic, constantly changing up until like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when we really started getting aggressive about like zoning laws and like all these specific requirements. So like examples of that is like in buildings, you have to have this like certain floor area ratio, right? Which really dictates how much of the space of the land that you can build on and what the ratio of the floor inside the building can be to the space of the land that you're building on. And then you have things like lot size minimums. So it's like, you can say, hey, you can build a big building here, or like you can build a single family home, but like ultimately like the lot can't be any smaller than this size. And so then that winds up spreading things out, right? And then you wind up with things like parking minimums, which is most relevant to what we're talking about. And, they have very specific rules in almost every single municipality that were written in like the 50s and 60s and constantly updated until today, dictate down to the level of like, okay, you have a church. For every 3 seats that you have in your church, you need to have 1 parking space. You have a fast food restaurant. For every 4 seats in your fast food restaurant, you need to have 1 parking space. And what this all winds up doing is like, I mean, first of all, it very directly adds to the cost of developing real estate, but then it also like basically stretches the fabric of the city. And what that means is now things are further away. It's less walkable. Now you have to drive places. Now there's more demand for parking. Now our expectation that the parking is going to be convenient and accessible and free keeps increasing. And so then they keep putting in more parking minimums and keep increasing the floor ratios and keep increasing the minimum lot size and things like that. And it's like it just stretched the city out. And so like now there's a lot of movement in the last 10 years of like, how do you undo that we've done to ourselves? It's really fascinating stuff because it does affect basically every day of all of our lives, right? If you think about it, like when's the last time you left your house, especially living in, the Detroit area, when's the last time you left your house and you were like not thinking about like, where am I going to park or like, what am I going to do when I get to the place I'm trying to go, right?
It's interesting when you think about just the church example. you go to church probably once a week for maybe 2 hours or something. The parking lot needs to exist to support that one time a week use, even for a restaurant. There's a Wendy's, there's a McDonald's. Hopefully you're not eating at Wendy's or McDonald's that often. Some people do. But to support that infrastructure for somebody to go, maybe, you go to McDonald's a couple times a year, whatever restaurant you go to a couple times a month, the parking needs to exist for the minimal use case. So you almost you have to find this optimal mix of utilization of all the real estate in the space, and whether it's the transport, the cars to get there, is that the most optimal use, is using cars? It's an entirely different conversation of like, hey, maybe we need more high-speed rail. Should we have more subways? Should we have more buses? It probably won't change. I think the US economy is kind of structured around cars, and maybe we'll shift a little bit, but I think the shift is more optimal use of the real estate that we have dedicated to it. Because like you said, insane amount. 8 spaces per car. It's probably bad for your business overall if there's less spaces, but it just seems like probably too many.
Counterintuitively, it's good for us in the sense that our whole thesis is there's 30% of the city that's dedicated to parking. There's no data right now about how it's being used, when it's being used, why it's being used. And so if you can, for the first time, create a system of record about that space, then you can start to collect that data. You can start to use it for the most optimal use case. You can start to say, we don't need 8 spaces for every single car because we don't need to lock up our spaces behind different gates and things like that, because we can basically allocate this space using pricing mechanisms or, based on people's license plates and things like that. So you can more dynamically use that space and make cities more efficient. Counterintuitively, I think in parking, the less supply there is, the better that it is for owners, right? Again, the sense that if you have too much supply, then parking is free, right? If you look at, we have owners reach out to us all the time that actually want to monetize their parking lot, and we have to turn them down because we're like, hey, you live in an area where there's a sea of free parking. As soon as you put up paid parking signs, the people are just going to go somewhere else. And so the supply being constrained is actually what makes the parking business exist. And that's a good thing in our opinion, is you shouldn't have so much parking that it should be free. And if it's free, then you probably have built too much parking, because that's just inducing people to drive more in this sort of negative feedback loop, or I guess positive feedback loop, in that it gets people driving more. But it's is that the optimal situation for cities? Not necessarily. And so if we can optimize it, constrain the supply to just the amount that we need, and then charge for it, that's better for cities. And I think also actually better for the people that wind up owning the parking assets in the long run.
There's a ton of studies around, a company will they'll change the usage, land use, they'll get rid of a 4-lane strip down Main Street and make it all walkable. And suddenly all the businesses make more money. There's more foot traffic. There are benefits too to redeveloping how we use some of this stuff. And maybe it was parking and no one used the parking or something, and redeveloping it. It's actually better for everybody. Everybody makes more money. It's probably healthier too. You get people walking instead of driving. That's probably better for society also.
The thing that I think gets lost sometimes in the conversation around cities and stuff is nobody's coming here for the parking lot. The parking lot is a means to an end. But sometimes people act like the parking lot is the destination. And it's no, people are coming here because they need to park because they're going to a shop or to a restaurant or to some local small business or something like that, not because they're trying to get excited about this parking lot. And so it's not about preserving the parking lots. It's about doing what's best for the businesses. And if parking happens to be a part of that, then that's great. And let's optimize that. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the destination itself.
How big is the US parking market if we wanted to give a dollar amount to it?
Yeah, good question. I think the National Parking Association has this big top-down study that they commissioned with Ernst & Young or something like that, and they put a number on 131 billion or something like that of dollars flow through the parking industry. Their definition of it's maybe, they're in the business of making parking sound as big as possible. Obviously, they're a parking association. That's an interesting way to look at it. But when I think about the market and think about how much of an opportunity there is for us, we're always thinking in terms of bottoms up analysis, and more so thinking in terms of how many parking lots are there that are parking lots that we manage that we think we can go after. And our estimates based on our database is that there's about 60,000-ish or so parking lots and garages that are paid public parking in the United States. And so that's a pretty massive impact if you can optimize some of those. And we're very small today compared to that, right? We have 200 locations. And if you look at the ones that actually produce the bulk of our revenue, there's a massive opportunity. I think that the parking market impacts us all day to day, but it's interesting in that nobody really definitively has a number on how much revenue the parking industry does. Also because, well, almost every single parking company in America is a privately owned company, maybe because of the history of sort of cash collection and not necessarily reporting income very accurately and things like that.
And there's probably some elements to getting economies of scale locally. It's probably better to own 5 lots instead of 1 or more than 5. It's probably also an unsexy business there's probably not a lot of people going out being like, I want to be a parking lot landlord.
Yeah.
So there's probably, I would assume, not a whole lot of turnover in terms of like market share probably doesn't change maybe a whole lot in terms of like how many spots in the city a landlord owns or something. I would just assume the big get bigger.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting about parking as like an asset class is that most owners of parking don't identify as parking owners, right? In the sense that like you own an apartment building and it happens to have a parking garage because your residents want to be able to park. You happen to own a strip mall and you happen to also therefore own a parking lot because people need a place to park when they come to these businesses. So it's not like there's not like institutional class, like we own a bunch of parking lots and parking garages. It's usually like real estate owners that happen to own parking. And as a result of that, I think that a lot of these owners, interestingly, like haven't been that sophisticated about parking as like a part of their business and how they can optimize that and how they can like run it as effectively as they run the other parts of their business. So, if you think about an apartment building, they're constantly thinking about like, how do we lease more apartments and how do we be more effective landlords and how do we promote this and like have the best amenities? And then parking is kind of just a sideshow that they don't really think about that much. And that's why there's so much opportunities, because it's kind of been this like neglected area of the real estate world for a long time. And we're basically coming to owners and saying like, hey, you should pay attention to this. If you run it like a business, there's actually pretty significant differences in returns in terms of what you can get out of this versus what you can't. And so then as a real estate owner, like your whole goal is how do I have basically upside over the next real estate investor so that I can purchase a property and like, increase its revenue and then turn around and like have a higher value property the next day, right? And so I think that that's what's really interesting about parking is just that it's like something that most people don't think about, even the people that own it. And the people that own it, basically it's either large institutions where they own a bunch of other real estate or like, 4 cousins who inherited the property from their grandpa. And, they are lawyers in New York. This is a real case. They're lawyers in New York and none of them have ever been to the city where the parking lot is. And none of them have ever seen the parking lot. None of them identify as parking lot owners. They're lawyers. Like they don't care about this parking lot. They have no idea what it does day to day. They don't care about any of that. They just want to know that it's being taken care of. And it's like very fascinating because like obviously nobody's really in the business of parking, but there's a lot of opportunity to optimize it and improve it.
The way that real estate typically works is you charge rent. At the end of the day, you pay all your expenses. There's this thing called net operating income, which is kind of just how the industry works. If you take all your existing financial statements and you suddenly say, hey, suddenly we doubled our parking revenue from doing nothing, that will mostly fall to that bottom of the profitability, the net operating income, the NOI. And that's how you typically value the business.
Yep.
So let's say you had, 10%, 15% NOI, parking was 5% of your revenue total, but you doubled it and it's mostly profitability. Like you could say you increased your NOI 50%. Maybe it's an extreme case. I don't know. But suddenly you're like 50% the value of the land from charging for parking. It's actually a pretty big change.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting in real estate from that point of view is that the way that real estate is valued is based on NOI and cap rates, right? And so like the simple math is if you have a 5% cap rate, then basically divide each dollar of NOI by 0.05, and that's the value of that, right? And so, if you increase the person's revenue or the NOI on an annual basis by $1, the value of their property just went up by $20, which is pretty significant if you add that up across a lot of dollars. And so it's kind of interesting just like having to shift that mental model where like VCs are thinking about like 1,000x returns and like real estate owners are like 1% is great. Or like, like obviously they don't want to like switch and like change their whole setup for 1%. But like if you can increase their revenue by 10%, 15%, 20% and make it very like confidently say that you can do that, that's a big deal for them.
Especially if the revenue is laying on top of an existing just cost structure and there's not a whole lot of expenses related to it. Obviously there's no such thing as a free lunch, but that significantly falls to the bottom line. And then let's say you just doubled the value of your real estate out of nowhere. If you're a smart real estate investor and you're safe about it, you can probably get a loan and increase the amount of debt on your property comfortably and still pay for it, pull out some cash, go buy some more. Exactly. Go buy some more real estate, improve the NOI on that, like you were kind of talking about, improving the parking. And then again, you got a loan out on that property, you improve the NOI, go buy another one. I mean, it's probably a little bit more complicated than what I just described, but it moves the needle.
It's simple, but it's not easy, right? It's like to actually execute on it. But like I've always thought that that's totally a thesis. Like I've always wanted somebody to basically come to us and basically be like, hey, I want to work with you guys to, buy assets where the parking's not monetized today. And like it totally could be. Because actually one of the most interesting trends that we've seen is like over the last few years post-COVID, people aren't necessarily going back to like office, right? But like they're going to like these sort of like urban infill. Like when I think about this, I think about actually like Grand Rapids, Michigan. There's these parking lots that we have in this kind of like sort of west side of the city. And it's like, there's bars, restaurants, pizza places, like all this sort of stuff. And there's just a couple small businesses we work with where they have a parking lot for their business and they opened them up and they make, $10,000, $20,000 a month or something like that, just monetizing their parking lot. And, there was totally net new income for them that was not there before. And it's like, you could probably go and find properties like this all across America, buy the real estate, turn on the parking lot for the first time in these kind of like densifying, like increasingly dense areas with restaurants and bars and things like that, where people are going post-COVID and like have a really interesting real estate thesis around that.
I don't know if you know, I'm actually from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I mean, I grew up there. I lived there for like 20 or 21 years.
Okay.
So I know exactly what you're talking about. West side, downtown-ish, Grand Valley State. That's where I went.
Yeah, just north of that. Yeah. Like it's on Bridge Street.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bridge. That's probably a little further north than what I'm thinking. But so I went to Grand Valley, classes downtown. I would park. I mean, I'd never paid for parking. So I would park just like on a side street, 10 block track to get to campus.
Yeah.
There's, I don't know. I still don't know. I probably wouldn't have paid, but there's
As
a lot
students,
Yeah, I was like the most. I did like 3 internships at a time, like tried to avoid student loans. Like I'd work like 40 hours a week while I also had full-time classes. Like I was hardcore, like let's get through this, like as little debt as possible. In a place like Grand Rapids, Michigan, $10K a month is a lot different than $10K a month in New York or San Francisco.
Yeah, and it's just, they're small businesses and like they have these parking lots, kind of like you said earlier to your point of like, the church has to build all these parking spaces, but they only use them on Sunday. Wendy's has to build all these parking spaces, but how often are you there during the daytime sort of thing? It's a like small business, like how often is their parking lot of like 50 spaces ever that full? They sort of hit the lottery in the sense of like this area grew up around their business. But I think there's a lot of business owners in America that have that same situation. And so, there's definitely an opportunity in that because those are the areas that are seeing insane growth in terms of demand. Parking is a very localized problem, right? It's like very much like localized supply and demand problem. People always kind of assume that parking is only a problem in like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, LA. But surprisingly, it's a problem in a lot of these small towns too. We used to manage a parking garage for the city or the town of Stillwater, Minnesota. It's a town of like 15,000 people. Most people would assume town of 15,000 people, there's no parking problem. But the problem is like as soon as everybody in the town wants to be in downtown on a Friday night, like, there's 4-block area that everybody wants to be in. Now you have a localized supply demand issue. And so now you have to charge for parking. It's very interesting how localized that problem is and how many just different pockets of opportunities there are across the country. And most big traditional parking operators are not going to operate in a town of 15,000 people. They just can't do it because they have too much overhead. Servicing those folks is one of the things that we do that uniquely nobody else really can.
So obviously my ability or my willingness to pay for parking on a Friday night, big event downtown, all my friends are going, a lot of social proof, like I got to go to this concert versus, middle of the day on Monday, I'll be like, screw that. I'm not parking. I'm not paying for this. You guys kind of enable that a little bit, dynamic pricing. How does that work?
Yeah, so we absolutely enable that. So it's one of the big things that we do that I think nobody else in the parking industry really does. And the reason for that is what we talked about earlier, that like the traditional parking managers, they're buying 3 different systems. They have an app from one vendor. They have a gate arm from a different vendor.
They don't talk.
They don't talk to each other. Yeah. The LPR system doesn't talk to the other system. The gate arm doesn't talk to the other system. There's no data all in one place. Their data is all in these different systems. Like I was just interviewing a candidate earlier and kind of showing them through our dashboard that we give to owners and like showing them, and I'm like, it's not good, but it's fine. We want it to be better. We're working on it. But like, here's what the status quo is. And I showed them like literally a spreadsheet that like one of the largest parking companies in the country used to give to the owner of this parking lot that we now manage. It's like just a dump in Excel of like a bunch of data. And you're like, what does this even mean? Like, I have no idea what's going on here. That's the state of data in the parking industry. And so the first step was basically for us to be able to build all of this integrated technology all in one stack, all the data's in one place, and we control the payment experience, right? So when you're parking in an AirGarage, as you experience, you're paying through AirGarage, either through our web pay product or through the AirGarage mobile app, right? And so all of that has to be built to enable basically what we do on the dynamic pricing side. And just one anecdote, I thought it was funny recently. He might listen to this podcast, so it'd be funny if he emails me after this. But I mean, it's possible. He's emailed me about podcasts before. But so I was at the National Parking Association recently, and the president of one of these parking companies was talking to me and basically was like, nobody does dynamic pricing in parking because it's harder than dynamic pricing in airlines and hotels. And I was just so blown away by that because I was like, why
is it hard?
Why is it so hard? How could you possibly think that dynamically pricing a parking space is harder than dynamically pricing a seat on an airplane?
I think I have a guess.
It's kind of crazy to me, but I think it comes down to the technology side of things. I'm curious what your guess is.
Well, I think it's with a when you go to park, it's like public. There's a sign that says what it is, versus with a hotel and airline, you're kind of booking it privately.
Sort of. I think that's an interesting theory. Yeah, I'm still trying to understand it. So if anybody has theories about why this would be, because it's like there's so many other factors that go into like an airline, right? It's like the seasonality, which seat you're paying for, which route you're flying on, like how much demand there is for that date at that time that you're booking. Like there's all the like people say like airline prices are the best on Tuesdays, these crazy things, right? It's like obviously a very sophisticated system. Our technology being integrated full stack, like owning the whole thing is what enables us to do this dynamic pricing. So we have the ability where we don't think of it just as, some owners we talk to and they're like, well, do you think like just jacking up the rates is the best thing? It's like, no. It's not about just jacking up the rates. It's about finding the optimal price. Like you said, on a Friday night different versus a Tuesday afternoon, it may not be the same. And so the way we do that is through basically experimentation. And so we'll just show, because you pay through your phone, we'll show like 5 different drivers that pull in all at the same time. We'll show them 5 different rates or 5 different slightly different rates, where one will see a rate, it's $6 an hour, but like we're dynamically increasing it in some function up to a set amount based on the occupancy of the lot. And then someone else will see like a flat rate. And then somebody else will see the same sort of range, but it's like exponentially increasing on a different function, all these sorts of things. And so then we're basically measuring everything downstream of that. Like, did you pay or did you not pay? Like, what review did you leave us? Did you wind up coming back later? Like, what's your return rate at this parking lot? All these sort of data points that feed into that to then be able to see, did you care that the price was higher, or what was your willingness to pay? And it's actually really fascinating. We have this case study of this parking lot that we took over in Charleston early this year. Really aggressive, like sort of not aggressive, like in terms of raising the rates, but just sort of this sophisticated dynamic pricing approach here where we're running experiments constantly like this. And you can see over time, as the experiments run, it like increases from the base rate up to like 55% above where the base rate is. And then it comes back down to like more like 42, 44% above the base rate, because we basically found that like after that point, you start to reach diminishing returns where you're increasing the rates to the point that people are no longer willing to pay. You start to reach the elasticity of demand issue. And so your revenue starts to drop. And so it's like that experimentation and data-driven process is what helps you find the best rates. So you can find out what is the optimal rate for a Tuesday afternoon versus a Friday night versus an event concert sort of thing. All these different factors that go into it, but it's like a massive amount of data and experimentation that goes into finding that.
And if I was just running a average parking lot in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, there's probably just a sign that says 1 hour is $1.60.
And you maybe change it once every few years or something like that. And usually the way that the pricing gets set is like, they kind of just like look around at all the other lots in the area, stick a finger in the wind and choose a price, right? Some people in the parking industry will say, oh, well, we have dynamic pricing. And we have like this internal meme that's like, you remember the like Windows and Mac meme from like or like the commercial from like the 2000s.
The cool
like,
guy was the cool Mac guy and the nerd guy was the PC.
Sort of this internal one where it's the nerd with the PC, but he's like sitting there with like an A-frame sign with like, $5 painted on it. And then like our dynamic pricing is the Mac guy, where it's like actual experimental data-driven dynamic pricing. And it's like, that's what they mean when they say dynamic pricing, is like they have some guy go out and change the sign because the lot's filling up and there's a Taylor Swift concert tonight, versus like ours is real time all the time at all hours of the day, finding what the optimal rate is based on what the drivers are telling us by what they're doing.
Just a funny anecdote. Went to a Pistons game. My mom sang the anthem at a Detroit Pistons game, their basketball team in the NBA. And I was trying to find a spot. I was kind of late.
Mom sang the anthem? That's so cool.
Yeah, she sings the anthem. She's done it for like 30 years.
Wow.
She used to sing a lot for the Grand Rapids Griffins. They're the American Hockey League team, the second best hockey league in the US.
Yeah.
She used to sing for them for years. We'd get free tickets to the games. So it was
That's
cool.
amazing.
That was the only way we could afford to go to hockey games. This is my mom sang the anthem. But yeah, she did it for the Pistons game. And I needed to park super close because I was late. I did not want to miss the anthem, which is, before the game started.
Detroit parking is the worst.
Yeah. And so as I was getting closer, there was one lot. It was like, I think I ended up parking a lot. It was like $80 for parking. And on a normal day, it was $7 or something. And there was a sign specifically. It's like Pistons parking, $80, $60, whatever the number was.
Yeah.
Just way too high. But people will pay because you got to get to the game. And I think there was also a Lions game, a Detroit Lions game, the NFL football team in Detroit at the same time. So parking was insane in downtown Detroit. I found one. But yeah, very expensive. So you had this really interesting, I think I saw it in a YouTube video on the AirGarage YouTube account. You said that traditionally landlords own a parking lot using a traditional operator. They might be missing out on 80% or they're paying 80% more costs. I forget. It was like an insane number. Basically, you can like 5x, 4x the profitability for a lot. That sounds like fake statistic. How does that work? Like, can you kind of walk us through why you would make so much more money using AirGarage versus a traditional operator?
Yeah, I have so many examples of this. It's hilarious. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that like the numbers sometimes just sound fake. Like it's honestly, it's a challenge on the sales side because like you want to tell people the amazing stories and like tell them the great returns that you've generated for some people, but they immediately assume it's not real. They're like, you're making this up.
Sounds like some crypto.
I can show you.
Yeah.
This is not crypto, Aircoin, but like, we always joke about Aircoin when, but, it's like, these are like real returns. And it comes down to one of two things, right? There's a lot of owners of real estate that are basically being screwed, and we're trying to help them not be screwed anymore. So I can give you a bunch of examples of that. And then there's a lot of owners who are not getting screwed. They have a pretty good setup, but they're just not optimizing. And so there's those two things, and those two things in tandem can lead to really big differences in terms of their revenue. So a good example of this, we took over a parking lot in Chicago, and there's this sort of like challenge that we deal with, which is that parking lots, the business model, we sort of talked about how it works, but we didn't necessarily talk about the business model. There's usually three models, right? First one is parking operator, parking management company just leases the parking lot from you. So they'll just pay you $10,000 a month. They take 100% of the revenue.
All the upside and also protect you from the downside.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that was like much more common 20 years ago when there was no data, no trust. It was all cash. And like nobody wanted to have to trust that their operator wasn't stealing from them, right? Not as common today, but still we come across those. And then the other one is like a parking, sort of like a management agreement where basically it's more like how an apartment building is managed. So like they'll pass through like a management fee every month. And then they'll pass through all of their costs to operate the location, usually on a slight cost plus sort of basis. So like they'll charge you for the uniforms, for their staff, and for the telephone bill, and for the machines and repairs and maintenance.
And then that's partially where it comes into like, hey, we also towed someone. Like it's a cost, we get a cut of it.
Yeah,
but maybe that doesn't quite
usually doesn't show up on that P&L, but like, I mean, it would be sort of a little bit separate there, but like maybe enforcement costs and like just staff time, things like that would show up on that P&L. And then the third one is like a revenue share. So AirGarage, for context, operates on a like gross revenue share. We think it's the most transparent thing, which is that, for every dollar that comes into the parking lot, we're going to split it with the owner, and then our portion will cover all the costs of operating, so that they always are getting like, 70%, 80%, whatever the percentages that we agreed on, they're getting that percentage of the revenue, the gross revenue. And then we're just covering all the costs. So they don't have to worry about like what extraneous things came up that month. They don't have to predict it. It's like, they just know I'm always going to get 70% or whatever, right? So it's very transparent, very simple. So back to the Chicago lot, they were previously on a lease, and they had been on this lease for like 20 years. They were getting paid like, say, like $30K or something, right? They were pretty happy with that, but they really don't know, like we talked about before, they're not in the parking business.
They don't know how good of a lot it is.
They have no idea how much this lot makes. They have no idea. They have no context. They have no financial transparency from the operator. And the operator likes it that way because they don't want you to know how much it makes, because then you would ask for a higher lease.
Yeah.
And so they're like, no, this lot, it's terrible. It's a terrible lot. I hate this lot. We're always losing money on this lot. Like, it's really terrible. And they like it that way, right? It's crazy. Yeah. And so there's like this asymmetric information war happening between the owner and the operator. It's like, you're not on the same side of the table. You're absolutely on opposite sides of the table. We basically approached this owner, and he's like, look, I'm interested in the concept. I'm getting paid this lease. It's stable, steady income that I can depend on. I have no idea how much it makes. Like, let me know what your proposal is.
You're
this
like, crazy startup that's coming in and making these insane...
Right. He's like, I don't know who you are. Like, I don't have time to think about this. I don't want to have to think about this, right?
Yep.
And so we basically were like, look, we'll do a study and we'll look at how much traffic you're getting, and we'll tell you how much your location's making based on the traffic and stuff like that. And we'll make you a proposal. And so we did that, and we studied it, right? And he's getting like maybe like a $30,000 a month lease. We study his lot, and we're like, this lot makes $100,000 a month. So you're getting screwed pretty badly.
This is revenue.
Total, top line parking revenue, $100,000 a month. And like, that's pretty normal for a lease. Like, I would say like 30 to 50% of the top line is pretty normal, but like that was definitely on the low end. He'd had that lease for probably like 20 years. So it's like, they've 3% increased it year over year. And like, Chicago has changed massively in the last 20 years. So like, he's, effectively getting screwed at this point, but doesn't know it. And like, that's not his full-time focus. And so we basically, studied the data, found, hey, you're really getting a bad deal, made him a proposal of like, we'll beat your current lease with a minimum guarantee, but you're actually going to get the upside of like a revenue share most months, because like it never goes below the minimum revenue, stuff like that. So that's an example of like, even without all of the crazy technology, even without real-time dynamic pricing, even without license plate reading cameras, any of this stuff that we're doing, just the deal structure was totally bad for them. But maybe an example on the other end of the spectrum is like, we have parking lots like the one that I think I mentioned in Charleston. We took over that facility, very traditional sort of operation, gate arms, attendant, local operator, very classic, like nothing explicitly wrong with it, right? Except that maybe the owner felt like the operator wasn't being proactive and data-driven and wasn't really technologically driven. So like more of like a champagne problem. Like, you're making me a lot of money, but like, Like, I wish you would go after it a little harder, sort of thing. And so we came in, we took over. That lot was objectively already running effectively, like making good money. But we still, through dynamic pricing, increased the revenue at that lot by like 44% over the first 6 months. And that was with the traffic basically being the same, if not a little bit down from last year. And that's purely because this lot is constantly filled. And the pricing scheme before was just stick a finger in the wind and choose a price. And that was the price for like 3 years.
And they were just undercharging, simply.
They were just undercharging. And I think that most people think that people's willingness to pay is a lot lower than it is. And at the end of the day, it's like for a driver, the difference between paying $5 and $5.50 is like not that meaningful to you, but to an owner across 1,000 rentals, that really adds up. We talked about the value of the real estate is like 20x. So
yeah, 50 cents is actually pretty big. 20% increase in revenue, 15% is like actually very, and you can like double your profitability.
Right. And if you get 50,000 rentals a month, like, it adds up. And so, that's a case where like the technology really drove increased returns of like 44%. But then, we have litany of other examples and stuff like that. But it's just crazy to me that there's so much opportunity just because, like we talked about, parking's always been this kind of like sideshow that people are just like, it's fine. I don't really need to pay attention to it. And now I think people are sort of waking up to this can actually be a business in and of itself.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking too, when you're talking about the lease model where, somebody's just getting 10K, 30K a month, but the property's actually generating way more, the owner, the landlord, doesn't even really know how good their real estate is. And there's also no real incentive to improve it. One of the things I think a lot about is like, why is this parking lot so shitty?
Yeah.
Like, no offense to all the parking lots that are very bad out there.
No, absolutely.
But it's probably like, to the person that owns it, they're like, it's just some crappy parking lot that like I don't need to develop. But then when you really look at the financials, you're like, this is such a great piece of real estate. Why have we been neglecting this parking lot? Let's make it better. Whether you redevelop it or add more layers or you just like improve the experience at the lot, there's just like this disconnect. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, well, that's why we like being on a revenue share, right? It's because like our incentive is like we want to maximize the revenue at this facility. And like there's so many things that go into that. It's like effective enforcement. It's making sure that the pricing is optimized. It's making sure that the payment process is simple and easy for the driver because like we want you to be able to pay and we want it to be a pleasant experience. And we want you to come back and we want you to be a loyal customer because that's how we maximize the revenue for ourselves and for the owner. And so it's like just a very simple like incentive alignment problem in some senses where the old model of doing things, incentives tend to be misaligned very often.
So you had this interesting point that I wanted to make sure we hit on, this Space Force. That's what it's called. The first time I ever kind of came across AirGarage, I was like, I wonder like how do they enforce? Like there's no gates, there's no like cameras or whatever. Like it just seems like you just park. How do you enforce this stuff? So what is the Space Force thing? How does it work?
Yeah, so the Space Force is like the logo that's on my shirt right now. The Space Force basically is our method of doing enforcement across the country. And so, how the Space Force got started is pretty interesting in the sense that what it is today, I'll tell you what it is today, but first, then we can go into the story. So basically, we have a network of like gig workers that we train, hire, work with, all that sort of stuff internally. Think of them like Uber drivers or DoorDash drivers, except what they do is they work with AirGarage as a member of the Space Force and they go to parking lots and they use the app on their phone and they scan license plates and they get paid to check if people are violators. And if they find violators, they get paid to issue tickets. And if they, repeat violators happen, they'll even get paid to like immobilize a car and things like that. And they can even like help us find people that need to be towed if like there's a really repeat violator. We try to avoid that. But the beauty of it is we basically have this ability to scale up and scale down enforcement anywhere and everywhere in the country. And, it's not just about like, we need to have full-time employees in any one location. Like I mentioned before, we have a parking lot in Clarksburg, West Virginia, town of 15,000, I think, in West Virginia. And like not a place you would traditionally think like a parking company would want to like operate kind of in the middle of nowhere. I've never been there. We took over this parking lot from a very traditional company, one of the biggest companies, like just
they
very
probably
old
wanted
school.
To get out. They're like, Clarksburg, we hate operating here, too unprofitable.
They have a full-time attendant just sitting in the parking lot. Another example of like just their deal structure was terrible. The parking lot doesn't make that much money. And so if you have a full-time attendant staff there, like that's the entire business, right? Basically, we took over this parking lot and they were just not doing that strict of enforcement before we took over. And like, I kid you not, the local Clarksburg news has written like hit pieces about AirGarage.
What?
Because like we've actually started enforcing the parking lot. And so residents are like up in a fuss about like the fact that it's being enforced. And so like whenever owners are like, hey, does your enforcement, like, does the Space Force, is it actually effective? Like you just have these gig workers. I'm like, well, the fact that like we can do enforcement and make it work in Clarksburg, West Virginia, of all places, of 15,000 people in the rural West Virginia, like I think we can make it work in pretty much every other city after that point. But basically, it's like it's all gig work. It's all economically incentive model. So it's like, we pay you per per scan. We pay you per ticket that you issue. So like we pay you for the exact amount of work that you're doing. And it's actually pretty fun, if I do say so myself, in the sense that like if you go through the parking lot, you use the scanner on your phone, you're scanning license plates and you're getting paid for every license plate. And so it's like a great dopamine hit.
It's almost like a dice roll, like gambling. Like, oh, I found somebody, like instead of getting paid 10 cents, I got paid $20 because I got a ticket.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's a random incentive sort of like delight problem. And it's awesome where like, yeah, you'll be scanning and basically like we talked about earlier, like if you find somebody that's like parked with us before and they don't have their info in this, or like we have their info in the system, but they didn't pay today, we'll have you like take confirmation photos of the car and then we'll pay you like a bonus for doing that because we want to make sure it's the right car and all that sort of stuff before we charge their card and things. And so like, you sort of get this random reward, sort of like a slot machine,
it's
I
like
guess.
a game.
Yeah,
you could say it's like playing Pokemon Go. You're on the wild with your camera.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes. We've designed the whole Space Force app, basically looks like a retro arcade game from like the 80s. So it's like, space themed. It's kind of like Space Invaders. And the way that the Space Force actually started is maybe interesting to talk about too, so we started, and we can talk about the AirGarage story more broadly in a little bit, but we started out with like college campus parking lots. And at the time, we were just like, how are we going to do enforcement? And we didn't really have a solution. We tried to sort of like outsource it to some third party, but quickly realized that was not going to work. We were like, we need to figure this out ourselves. And we were just like, it was actually around the time, we were getting started. We were very scrappy. I was living on campus at the time for the summer. Probably didn't have a job full time besides like working on AirGarage. And every night at like 10 p.m., I would go out and I would collect bird scooters as like a bird charger.
Yep, I remember those days.
Which was a lot of fun. It was like I would basically run out of my dorm right at 10 as you could collect scooters starting at 10 p.m. Run out of my dorm, find the first scooter, collect it. You get $5 per scooter. You
charge it,
run it back to, or then I would ride over to 2 other scooters, stack them on top of that scooter, and then ride them back to my dorm room, charge them overnight. And it was $15 a day to like pay for my lunch, which was great. And so we basically were like, could we apply that model to enforcement? And the way we started out actually was like Space Force was entirely peer-to-peer. So it was like you would park in an AirGarage parking lot. And then after you started your rental, there would be like a little portal to the Space Force area of the app, a little like space-themed portal. You click on that and we would have drivers scan each other's license plates basically and report violators to us. And people loved it. It was insane. And we were like, wow, like this is really magical. And so like you would scan cars, you would earn points at the time, and the points were just good for like basically free parking. And so like you could earn free parking by scanning our license plates in the parking lot that you're already parking in. And so of course, university students like yourself working multiple jobs and internships in college really loved that. I remember having the epiphany sort of moment of like, wow, this is like a very special product, because I was in one of our parking lots in Tempe where we got started, and I was watching this girl scan license plates. And she's basically like, this is very stereotypical, but she's like platinum blonde hair in like 6-inch stiletto heels, walking around with like her little like purse on her shoulder with her poodle in the purse and like a cigarette in her left hand. And she has her phone and she's scanning, license plates, checking if people have paid for their parking. And I'm like, it blew my mind, because I was like, in no other world would this person ever have been a parking attendant or a parking enforcement officer, except in a world in which the Space Force exists.
Wow.
And so that was a magical product moment where it's like, if you make it like really frictionless for people to do these things, like people will do it and people are excited about doing it. And so that's where like this whole thing became. And then we eventually made it more like an official like gig work platform. And like, that's how people like do it today, is like we pay you per scan and we recruit from like a variety of like online platforms and get people online. And it enables us to do enforcement pretty much anywhere and everywhere across the country. And the last point I'll make is just that I was talking to the CEO of like a regional parking company last week. And I thought it was really interesting, because what he said to me was, I think what's most disruptive about AirGarage is not actually like the sort of technology, like the payment stuff that you've built. It's more so your ability to be able to operate a facility anywhere in the country, which is like totally different from everybody else, where everybody else has to hire a general manager for that region before they can even take over a property. And so you guys have this unique ability, and like that's really disruptive. And I think it's disrupted a lot of people's business models.
You basically have a base fixed cost that you must cover if you're a traditional full-time attendant and all that stuff. How do you make sure that I'm just not like abusing it and just making a shit ton of money, just scanning license plate? No, not necessary, like too much gig work in one area?
The number of things that the Space Force comes up with definitely keeps us on our toes. Like, I mean, the Space Force has existed for several years now. And so like we've gone through many iterations of like different scams that people came up with. One recently was, and like honestly, every time we come across one of these, we're like, man, this person's creative. I remember one of the early ones, there was a garage in Salt Lake where this guy basically just got his wife's phone and would just scan both phones at the same time. And so you would just like bring 2 phones and scan alongside each other.
So
and
it
like
wouldn't register
just
quickly
register.
enough?
Yeah, well, it would just register. We had no protection for like scanning at the same time with 2 different phones. So, whenever we find a scammer, we kind of just ban them and build a fix for that scam. So that was one. So it's like now there's a cooldown period, like you can't scan within a certain time frame of somebody else scanning, stuff like that. And then one recently that I thought was pretty creative was somebody was basically, garage we managed in Philadelphia. You get paid a bonus if you leave a ticket, right? But you have to submit a photo proof of the ticket. And so just to save time, I guess, they would just take the ticket off the car and put it on the next car and take a picture of that one. And so like whenever they found a car with a ticket, they would just put the same ticket on it. And so we noticed because our payment rate on the tickets was significantly lower for that person than everybody else. And it's because they weren't actually leaving the ticket. And it's like people come up with all sorts of creative things, honestly. Like all of these gig workers, right? They're like entrepreneurs. They're like thinking of creative ways. And it's like fascinating that the like best way to find out the ways that people are going to scam you is just put the product in the real world and like let them scam you. And it's like, it's not huge dollar values. So it's like, whatever, not the end of the world. You're a bad actor. You get off the system, but you just made the system better for everybody else, which is great.
People look down on gig workers. I just think it's not fair.
No, not at all.
I don't think nothing can compare to the ability to like pick up your phone and just start making money and just start working.
It's amazing.
There's no hours. There's no like political BS related to like your relationship with your boss. Like that's important, but there's some people that are just really hard workers, but like they don't know English, so no one will hire them, or cultural reasons, they can't do certain jobs, they have a disability. So it's impossible to get interviews and get hired. The rise of it, I think it has, there's downsides to it, but I just think it's like a pretty amazing opportunity for people to literally just start making money at any time. You can work 20 hours a day if you want, or you can not work for 4 days. Like you can just start making money. Of course, there's a cap, but it's pretty incredible. It's probably one of the biggest changes to just how the labor force works, like in the history of humanity. So like maybe that's a little bit of a proclamation, like a bold statement, but I think it's true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the thing that's the most inspiring and fascinating to me is just that like you said, there's no political BS. What you put in is like what you get out of it in the most pure, raw form. Like we have enforcers that have been working with us for years. They just applied one day and then they kept showing up and they kept scanning plates. And then eventually over time, like we noticed that they're really consistent. We noticed that they're really responsive. We noticed that they're helpful, like sending us photos of like things that are wrong in the lots and stuff like that. And it's like entirely something that's like within their own control that they can like dictate the destiny of their own life, right? Which is amazing. And it's like they're not dependent on like anybody else to notice them or to hire them or to give them a chance. It's like you sign up for this, you put in the work, and like with any other gig work platform too, not just with Spaceforce. If you do that, like you can make good money and you can have something predictable and good income and stuff like that, which is amazing. And I think that there needs to be more opportunity like that in America for people that are down on their luck or like just moved here and immigrated here and like they want to get their start. I was in a parking lot that we manage in Baltimore recently. I was like talking to the enforcer there, super friendly guy, like does like social work and is just like, yeah, like it's a really heavy job. And like, I just like to get outside and be on my feet between my social work engagements. And like, this is a great way to get outside, like make some money, take a little break, decompress, and like get on with my day. And I'm like honored that we can provide that for you.
Can you explain how you pay? Because, traditionally when I think put the card in the gate, the arm that goes up and down, can you just talk us through how that works?
Yeah, the main way that you pay, obviously, it's through your phone. The signs that you saw, for example, in the parking lot in Detroit are actually like old versions of our signs. But basically, you pull into any AirGarage parking lot, we have our branded sort of custom, try to make them really clear, simple, easy to understand signs.
They're orange and they stand out.
They're very orange.
I wouldn't say they're ugly, like but they pop. It's orange. Pop. It's a color.
Yeah, we chose orange very intentionally, that we wanted a color that would pop and like be this bright, happy color that like you can associate with a pleasant experience, not every other parking company in America is basically red or black or blue. And we're the only orange ones, which I think is interesting and something we can talk about branding more later. But yeah, so you pull in, there's signs, we try to make them as simple as possible, right? Because most parking lots, you drive in, there's like 15 different signs and they're like paragraphs long and they're different fonts and you're like, just tell me what to do. Like, I don't know what to do. And there's like 3 different ways to pay. There's Park Mobile, there's Pay by Phone, there's Spot Hero, there's Parkways, like there's the machine. You're like, what do I do? Like, I don't know. Just try to make it as simple as possible. So you like either text pay to the phone number that's listed on the sign, or you can scan the QR code. Both of them will get you to basically the payment page. And that payment page, we try to make it as simple as possible. All it asks you for is your license plate, your credit card, your phone number. Once you've texted us, we already know your phone number. So even if you're a first-time user, all you have to do is put in your credit card and your license plate, and then you press start when you get there, and you basically press end when you leave, so that we charge you for the exact amount of time that you actually parked for. So if you park for an hour and 36 minutes, we'll charge you for an hour and 36 minutes instead of for 2 hours or 3 hours if you stay a little over. Right. And so we prorate it, which people really like. It's kind of like when you think about like the Uber magical effect, where like you see on the Uber, like I paid $9.47 for my Uber. It's kind of like I paid for exactly what I owed. Same thing with parking. It's kind of a pleasant experience. We get a lot of positive reviews from drivers that are like, I just love that I got to pay for exactly what I used instead of like stayed for an hour and 1 minute. Now you're charged for 2 hours. So you pay through your phone. And the other thing that enables basically is, we talked about earlier, we have a memory of who you are. Unlike most parking companies, it's a very simple customer account, right? So once you've paid with us one time, two things. The next time you text that phone number, all your info is saved. So it's just one tap to start your rental the next time, which is easy.
Yeah, that's
true.
But
then also in more and more of our parking lots and garages, we basically have license plate reading cameras that actually track every car that goes in and goes out of the parking garage. And so if you drive past that license plate reading camera and we see you enter the facility, then we'll actually just text you and say, hey, welcome to the facility. And when you leave, we'll say, hey, thanks for coming. And we'll charge you for the exact amount of time that you parked. As long as your info is on file, you basically don't even have to touch your phone. The ultimate magical sort of checkout free experience that we're trying to create, it's kind of like Amazon Go, but for parking lots and garages. Because like we talked about earlier, like you're not here for parking. The parking is not the destination, it is a means to an end. And so the optimal solution of how much time you spend thinking about parking is zero. So like you pull in, you park, you go on your way, you come back, you leave, you get charged, magic.
The last time we parked in that lot in Detroit, I got a text an hour like after I got home. It's like, hey, are you still parking? And I was like, oh shit, I forgot to check out.
Yeah.
It was like a couple bucks, whatever.
Yeah, that's definitely like one of our biggest complaints is like people that forget to end their rental. So that parking lot doesn't have license plate reading cameras. Eventually when it does, we would have automatically ended it for you. We try to like as much as possible, make it really obvious, but you're right that like definitely some people forget.
Could you do a GPS thing? Like when you leave the
I wish. I really wish.
Can't.
No, because like, well, first of all, it's a web experience. But then secondly, like iOS is just so strict about always on background location. And so like, it's actually funny. I sent this to our sort of product leadership team, my co-founders in the product team and stuff like that. I saw this like somebody left us a review on Google, a 5-star experience. They're like, such a magical experience that they use GPS to automatically like end your rental and start your rental for you. And I'm like, if only it was that easy. Like, I wish it was that easy to just use GPS, but like iOS is so protective over always on background location. It's all license plate reading cameras, which is way harder to do than just using your background info on your phone from your location. But yeah, no, unfortunately, it's so locked down. Like, if you're using always on background, it's like basically a just bright red thing at the top of your screen at all times being like AirGarage is using your location. So unfortunately, it doesn't fly.
Are you comfortable sharing like what is the state of the business today? How many lots, how many parking spaces, revenue, number of employees?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about it is we manage basically like 225 parking lots and parking garages across about 37 different states now. And the way to think about like that scale relative to maybe a traditional parking operator, we have a team internally. Our full-time employee count is like 44. A good amount of that is sales, a good amount of that is engineering, all that sort of stuff. But the important number is basically like how many operations team members do we have? And it's 6 full-time operations team members overseeing a portfolio of 225 properties, when a traditional parking company might have
6
50,
for one lot.
50 or 100 people just in one city. Or they might even, like you're saying, like 6 people overseeing one facility. And so it's like a totally different paradigm in terms of what you're doing, employee structure wise. And the reason for that is like, I always tell this story about like, I think it's really funny when we were getting started in parking, we're kind of coming at it from this technology angle and lens. I remember one of the first things people said to me, like the traditional companies, they were basically like, you don't get it. Parking's a people business. Like, you don't understand. It's not about the technology. And like at the time, I was kind of like, just a little indignant or whatever. I was like, you don't get it. I know better than you, sort of thing. But like what I've realized basically over time, they are absolutely right that parking is a people business. Like what real estate owners care about is like having a partner that they can trust and like know that we're going to do a good job. But the key to having the best people is to have the best technology, because like otherwise all your people have to be just the on the ground people, just like doing the day to day, like making sure the gates aren't broken, making sure that the pay machines are working, making sure that like people are able to pay, and the basic rote day to day stuff that should be automated. They're spending their time on that. And if you automate all of that through the technology and actually make it work, then you can have your operations team focus on the like bigger picture question of like, how do we optimize this asset? How do we drive more revenue here? How do we be the best partner for the owner? And so I think that metric for us of like 6 operations, full-time team members to 225 locations is like one of the most mind-blowing or important metrics about us as a business versus like the traditional parking companies. But yeah, so scale today, 225 locations, 37 states, 44 employees, but 6 operations.
So how do you acquire a parking lot?
So just to be clear, when we say acquire, we're signing a contract with the owner. We're not buying it from them.
Fair,
Just want to make sure.
Acquiring a customer, I guess. That's how I should have said that.
Yeah, fair. I just want to make sure it's clear to everybody else. It's a lot of cold calling. Our growth strategy has always been kind of dependent on cold calling, at least since 2020, which we can talk about how that changed over time. But real estate owners tend to not be looking for a change. They're not going out and actively like Googling like parking lot management companies. The liquidity in the parking market is interestingly like low. And that's part of why like we went very national with our approach from the very beginning, right? Like we took over our first like 10-ish locations all in Tempe, Phoenix, Arizona, like where we went to school. But then quickly as we realized like, hey, if we want to grow as fast as we can, we need to go pretty national with this. In the grand scheme of things, there's not that many parking lots and like they don't change hands all that often. And so if you want to grow at a fast enough rate, we need to be national versus like someone like an Open Door started just in Phoenix for the first few years because like it's single family homes. There's a lot of single family homes and they change hands really often.
Liquidity is a little bit different.
Liquidity is very, very different. And so for us, it was like, let's go national. And so I think actually our first fun fact for you, our first parking lot that was not in Arizona, I think was actually in Ann Arbor, is the First Baptist Church of Ann Arbor. I think it's on State Street maybe or something like that. That was one of our first non-Arizona locations. But all of it comes down to reaching out to people and like getting in front of them and basically being like, hey, would you like to take a look at something and see how we can increase your revenue and things like that. So it's a lot of go-to-market, like outbound cold calling. And, we're basically trying to apply this like B2B SaaS go-to-market motion that everybody does sort of like in SaaS sales pretty typically of like building a sales machine and like, how do you have SDRs and how do you have a sales operations team? And like, how do you do this machine and sort of mechanized warfare? And we're basically bringing that to an industry where the traditional way that a business grows is purely through like Rolodex sort of business development sales of like, usually the way a parking company grows is like they have a general manager for Houston. That general manager is responsible for overseeing the P&L, the operations, and business development. And so naturally, once they get enough locations, all of their time is going to the P&L and operations, which is urgent, but not necessarily the important thing, which is business development. And so they naturally sort of taper off over time. They're not doing as much business development. And so it's like we have a separate sales team, separate operations team. Sales team is just responsible to go get new locations in that mechanized warfare sort of way. And then operations team, once we sign a contract with them, takes them, onboard them, manage them, make sure that they're happy for the long run, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very different approach to selling into the industry versus the traditional way of doing things. And I think it's a shift that people are like ready for because like I talked about, people are starting to wake up to the fact that parking can be this like asset class that you can make money on and stuff like that. And so the sophisticated owners respond well to that more sophisticated sales motion versus just like, I met this guy at a dinner and I shook his hand and he seems like a good guy and he could run our lot. Let's give it to him. It's like, it's a legitimate asset and like you want to manage it effectively, just like you do any other asset.
So thinking through just some of the numbers you've shared so far, somebody's paying $10K a month, you bump it up to $30K a month in top line revenue that they generate. You guys take a 30% cut. So we'll say that's like $9K a month, maybe $10K a month. You can get to some of these parking lots, you're making like $100,000 in revenue a year.
It depends on the parking lot, obviously. I mean, we have parking lots that are 8 spaces. We have parking lots that are 2,000 space garage. We have parking lots that are 15,000 spaces. So it definitely depends, but it's interesting. There's never like a direct correlation between space count and revenue. But yeah, I mean, like a good example is there's a parking lot in like coastal, like Gulf Coast area, right? And like this couple bought the parking lot. It used to be a gas station, tore down the gas station, put down gravel, nothing fancy, not even paved. We put up signs for them.
Low maintenance.
In the summertime, that parking lot does like $50,000 a month. And it's like, they bought it for a very reasonable price. It was just a dilapidated gas station. That's a very good real estate investment. Something that you can only make if you're like a local that knows the area. It's a beach town. That parking lot is packed during the summertime. And so, yeah, I mean, like if that parking lot averages like $30,000, $40,000 a month, like we take maybe like 20% on that one, I think, or something like that. So it's like, yeah, we make $120K a year, but then we have to pay for our expenses. So that margin can be like, 60 to 80% depending on the parking lot. So it's like what's left over after that is kind of like what I think of as our software revenue.
I feel like rule of thumb in SaaS is like you got to get to 100K contracts or roughly 6 figures.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it sounds like it maths out without sharing too much.
I think it seems like it makes sense pretty well, especially because churn is just so low. I mean, like our churn on like a GMV dollar basis is like sub 2% per year. You sign these contracts and they just stick around for forever. And so then it's just like a matter of just like the way to build compounding growth is just like keep signing on bigger and bigger cohorts and they just stick around forever. Like if you look at, we have this chart internally that we look at and it's basically the net dollar retention on a GMV basis for every cohort that we've ever signed on a quarterly basis. So it's like, you're looking at this cohort that we signed on in Q2 of 2019, how much GMV are they doing relative to their first full quarter? All of them are above 100%.
And so you might get the 2% average churn, but you also like doubled their GMV maybe in an extreme case.
Yeah, or like, traffic's generally increasing or like we're increasing like better enforcement, better advertising, all these sorts of things. There's value add services. So it's like, yeah, every cohort that we've ever signed on is above 100% on a like net dollar retention of GMV for that cohort because of those services and because of low churn, which is an amazing way to build a compounding business. Because then all you have to figure out is like, how do I get more customers?
Yeah.
I would much rather have that than a business where it's like, I was talking to a friend founder recently, and it's like we were comparing. It's like have the opposite problems where it's like for us, it's like
no.
hard to get businesses, hard to get new business, but like once you get it on, it's very sticky. For them, it's like very easy to get new business, but once you get it on, it's like leaky bucket. And I'm like, I think I would rather have this one, so then at least you're not just drowning under the water.
The ease of acquisition can change at any time. I mean, we kind of see that with the ebbs and flow of the market versus if it's just a sticky product that there's no reason to switch necessarily.
I think it's like they go hand in hand, where it's like this is a lot of what we think about internally day to day is like, how do we truly make a product that is different and not just better than the traditional companies, right? Because in the beginning, when it's like we're trying to compete with SP Plus and LAS and these big traditional operators, we had to just get to feature parity with them. It's kind of like we think about this mental model of like the hot swap of you're trying to compete full stack with these traditional companies. You have to be able to do everything that they can do. The owner doesn't care that you use technology. They just care that you're getting the job done. And so you need to build your technology to be able to do all of the edge cases that they do. And so like the first part of our product development was just a lot of that. There's like a scene in the Indiana Jones movie where he's basically like trying to swap the golden skull on the pedestal for like the bag of sand without setting off the booby traps. And like that's kind of what you're trying to do is you're trying to swap the new technologically driven product in for the old product without the owner necessarily noticing that there's a difference. And so then like maybe a year ago, we noticed like, hey, owners are starting to say, instead of like, I don't think AirGarage is up to handling my parking lot, they're saying, this sounds great, but I don't see what's different between you and this traditional company. And we're like, that's pretty amazing because like we're 2 years, 3 years into this and like we just built this and they have 15,000 employees. So like that's very different. And then now it's all about, okay, now that you've built that fundamental foundation of like the product and the data and the infrastructure that you need, how do you build these things on top of it that truly differentiate license plate reading cameras and dynamic pricing and stuff like that they can't do because systematically they're not equipped to do it.
They don't have any engineers. They're
maybe they do, but they're like just busy duct taping together 5 different systems. And so then that's where like over time, as you build more of that accelerates customer acquisition and makes the product stickier, kind of a win-win where it's like, if we show you something that's just like radically different from what you're used to seeing, like you're much more likely to be interested in that versus something that's just marginally better than what they're using right now.
Going back a little bit, you mentioned the GMV cohorts always being over 100%. This is like transaction revenue top line, but you guys are probably taking a smaller cut than the traditional operator. So your customers, the landlords, are probably seeing significant increases in how much they make over time.
Our percentage doesn't like change over time as the revenue expands necessarily. So, I mean, their net operating income on a dollar basis is generally trending upward, but like as a percentage of gross revenue would be staying the same. But if GMV is increasing and percentage is staying the same, that means their net operating income is also increasing on a dollar basis. But yeah, I mean, usually like what we'll do for real estate owners is we'll just look at like their P&L and we'll be like, hey, this is what you're netting as a percentage right now on your management agreement. We'll structure a revenue share such that you're getting the same percentage. So even if we don't increase your revenue, you're going to get the same percentage of the revenue that you're getting right now. And then we're going to work really hard to increase your revenue. And like that always, I think, works out pretty well, where it's like our incentive is we want to increase the pie because that's how we make our portion as big as possible. We want to beat the numbers that you had before because we want to live up to the expectations that we set. Worst case, if we underperform, like you're still going to be getting basically the same NOI percentage of your gross revenue that you're getting right now. So as long as we don't like royally screw up and like shrink your pie somehow, which would be very hard to do, you'll be in a pretty good place.
It says on LinkedIn that you've been doing this for 7 years.
Yeah.
Maybe one question is why, but also how did it all get started?
I mean, the why is just because like it's such an interesting problem. I think this is one of those things that's like a fractal problem, right? Where it's like you keep digging into it and there's more and more that you can solve as you get into it. We can kind of talk about that, but like there's been all these different eras of AirGarage. I was just talking to somebody yesterday and they were like, how are you not burnt out after like 7 years? And I'm like, I just don't think it's been 7 years in my head. It's like the era that we're currently in has been like a year and a half, right? And so like that's very different from thinking about the 7 years.
So maybe what are these eras? Maybe we can unpack the different eras.
We'll explain that sort of as we go through the history here. So, how AirGarage got started. So I met Scott and Chelsea at Arizona State University. Scott and I met through basically this thing called like the Flynn Scholarship, which is this foundation in Arizona started by the Flynn family. And basically their whole thesis is like, how do we improve the quality of life in Arizona? And one of the ways that they do that is through the Flynn Scholarship, which is basically their way of bribing the top 20 Arizona high school students every year. Bribing you to not go to an out-of-state Ivy League or whatever, and bribing you to go to an in-state by like paying you a lot of money, like to pay for your tuition, your room and board, travel, stipends, all this sort of stuff, right? So Scott and I were both in that, and that's how we met. And Scott was kind of always like working on different startups and things like that. I was studying physics and economics, so I was not in the startup scene.
Interned at NASA, I think I remember.
So I did research that was funded by NASA through the NASA Space Grant Program, and that was at Arizona State University. So I was in basically a material science lab and wound up publishing a paper with their funding, which is cool. That was a totally different era of my life in terms of, it's like, the paper was on photochemistry with diamonds, which I could tell you all about, but probably would bore most of the people listening to this.
I mean, if somebody stuck through an hour of parking,
right? They're probably like,
interesting.
This is more interesting than parking. So that was a cool experience, but actually research was one of the things that made me realize like my plan was kind of default, like I'm studying physics, I'm going to get a physics degree and I'm going to go to grad school and get a PhD in physics. And thank God I didn't do that. But part of the reason was because like the research feedback loop is just so slow. You're like just waiting constantly for red tape and bureaucracy and like trying to get things moved forward of like ordering parts. And like, it's just like not a very fast feedback loop. And then I'm like watching Scott like working on these like apps and things like that.
Like
the feedback loop
things,
is so quick.
Crazy.
It was amazing. And so we met Chelsea through a lab at ASU, and it was basically a lab that the president funded and put together and was just like work on crazy skunkworks projects and stuff like that. Don't need to get into that, but that's how we all met. We started working on AirGarage just because like we had the personal pain point of like parking on campus is a pain, right?
The classic college student problem.
Classic. And like I always say, like the three things that every college student thinks are like the main only problems in the world is like textbooks are too expensive, finding social events and friends on campus is hard, and parking on campus sucks, right? Like to a college student, like that is the entire world of problems. And so like, of course, we started working on one of those things. Originally the way that we solved this was like, I just went across the street into the neighborhood next to campus because I kind of had heard that like people had done this. And I was like, oh, this is a good idea. Like, so obviously the university, it's Arizona State University basically has a 1 mile square campus. And then like on either side is a neighborhood. And like the city obviously is smart. They put permits on those streets. So you can't just park on those streets. But I was like, oh, I'd heard that people would do this where you just go knock on doors. And so I just went and knocked on a bunch of people's doors and was like, can I park my car at your driveway?
And they give you their permit, basically?
No. I literally like found this guy. His name was Ari. And he was like, yeah, sure. I have 2 spots in my driveway. I only have 1 car. Just pay me $50. You can park here whenever you want.
So driveway, there was no permit?
Yeah, no permit.
Yeah, okay.
So I just would park. Yeah, it was permits for the street. And so I would just park in his driveway. Basically what happened is like, we started sort of telling our friends about this naturally as college students who had gotten a good deal. It's like, you guys are suckers for paying $800 for the campus garage. I'm paying $50 for some guy's driveway. Yeah. And people started being like, well, that's cool. I would love to do that too, but I don't want to go knock on random strangers' doors just to find a parking spot. And so that was like, oh, there's a business here. And so, the way we originally got started, like I actually just sent somebody a screenshot of this yesterday. Very first version of AirGarage was like, we put out like 200 flyers on people's doors, and they were like the ugliest flyers possible. Like just a photo of a house, like an orange bar across the top, ugly logo. And it was like, do you want to make more money this holiday season? No context. It just said that. And then it said sellmydriveway.com. Sellmydriveway.com was the URL. I think we still own that URL. If you go to it, it'll go to AirGarage. And nice. So it takes you to a website. And this website is just one page. It's just an orange page with 1 paragraph of text, AirGarage logo, 2 buttons, list a spot, rent a spot sort of thing. And the paragraph just says like, AirGarage is a platform for students to rent spaces from homeowners, that sort of thing. Yep. You click on the book a spot button, nothing happens because we didn't build that part. If you click on the list a spot part, takes you to like a Google form that you fill out and asks you way too much personal information for like a homeowner. It was like, what's your address? Why are you interested in this? How much would you want to rent your spot out for? Like all that sort of stuff. Way too much personal info. We put out like 150 or 200 flyers. And I think 11 people signed up and listed their driveways. And we were like, oh, this is interesting. People would be interested in this.
You got some inventory to work with.
And so then that was kind of like, that was the MVP. Scott then built the sort of like first version of like the actual website because we were like, if people will do it through this crappy, really terrible flyer, scammy URL, like really, scary form that you're putting way too much info in, then they'll do it with an actual website. And so we started out with that. AirGarage sort of 1.0 was this like peer-to-peer driveway rental platform. And like, I basically just spent all summer going through the neighborhoods in Tempe, Arizona. So it's like 115 degrees, going door to door every day. And like, I hated it because like, I was a physics kid. Like I was a nerd. Like I'd never done sales before, but this is how I learned to do sales was like, literally like I would go out there in the heat and like at 4 p.m. when people are just starting to get back from work, and I would force myself to like knock on 1 door to talk to 1 person. And like, I would just like eventually then over the course of the summer got to the point where I was like knocking on doors and nobody was answering. And I'm like, I need people to sign up. Please answer. Like, and so like it went from like barely could get myself to knock on 1 door to like, I'm knocking on tons of doors every single day. And like, we signed up probably like 100 or so spots near the university and then like sold them all out right as soon as campus came around. And so that was the original very early 1.0 like version of AirGarage was just this driveway rental marketplace.
In terms of if I'm somebody trying to learn sales, is the best way to just do it?
Absolutely.
And you submit yourself to like the uncomfortableness of putting yourself out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like a lot of things. Like you can read as many books as you want, but like the books and what you read and the videos that you watch are not going to mean anything until you actually experience it. That was what was really impactful for me, was like I was doing the sales and then I would read the books and then go back and do the sales. And it's like now you're thinking about the things that actually matter and like keeping them in the back of your head. Like I remember one of the books that I read early on was by Chris Voss.
Never Split the Difference.
Never Split the Difference, right? Yep. Thank you. I was about to forget
He's
the name.
the Navy SEAL or something, or FBI negotiator.
Yes.
Yep. I've seen that guy do like a motivational speech at a conference. Really? It was so good. Like that guy's so intense. I loved him.
Yeah, it was an amazing book because like he basically, he breaks down a negotiation, and like every other chapter is like a story about a negotiation that he's doing with some terrorist.
Like a terrorist.
Yeah, and then like, the other chapter is just about how to deal with that situation. It's so effective for sales because all of sales is basically a negotiation of me trying to get you to pay attention to me and like give me some time. And, I remember there's like a cheat sheet that somebody put together of those tactics of that book that I just had printed out that I would like kind of review every day and be like, okay, these are the things that I need to keep in mind. One of the most impactful things you can learn to do is just to be quiet sometimes. And like when you're talking to somebody, just like let the empty silence hang, because like most people get really uncomfortable when it's just like an awkward pause. And they'll just start talking. It's just simple tips and tricks like that like you can read that in a book all you want, but if you don't ever go apply it, I don't think that it's never gonna help you. And so I think that, definitely to learn sales, the only way to do it is just trial by fire and to get out there and face the rejection. But you also, I don't want to say you have to love it, because I have grown to love sales, I think. I saw this tweet once and it was basically like the skills that you need to learn in life. And it was like it's not a scientific tweet or anything like that, but like it's like these 6 skills that the person was positing that you need. And like basically the bottom 2 were like, software engineering and sales. And the point that they made at the bottom of the tweet was like, you need to learn these 6 skills and you should learn them in this order, because the order of these is like in increasing basically like dopamine hit or like feedback loop. And like once you learn a skill that's like lower on the list than the prior skill, you can never go back and learn the skill before it, because like you're already so tuned to the fast feedback cycle and dopamine hit of the thing below it that like the other one will feel slow. And so their whole thing was like, sales is important as a skill, but the dopamine hit that you can get from it and like the feedback cycle that you can get from it is like so fast. Like you can be having a conversation with somebody live and like it's amazing that you can like convince them of something and like convey an idea and communicate effectively and walk out of a meeting with a deal that you just struck with somebody that was diametrically opposed to everything that you stood for, which is amazing and like a really powerful skill. And I think once you learn it and do it, then it's kind of addicting in a good way.
Yeah. And I'd assume just the order of operations, like computer science, for example, you sold someone a tech product, but you don't know how to build it. It's probably important to know how to build it, know what you're selling. That'll probably help you sell. But also it's like, if you don't understand what you're selling to someone, it's a little bit scary to think you're closing $1 million deal, not actually knowing what's being delivered.
Yeah.
So you did Airbnb for driveways. That's essentially what this was. And I've heard you say it's not a good business. Like, why is that not a good business? And then how did you guys kind of transition from there?
Yeah, I think it was just, it was all about like just bad unit economics. And, at the time, it's not like we were really focused on unit economics or anything like that, right? Like we started this as a side project in college, like to solve our own parking problem. And then we just kind of kept pulling on the thread that customers were giving us of like, what do they want and how can we make value, right? And so, at some point, we basically had like decided that we were going to drop out. And as we were working more full-time on the company, started to realize like, how much scale you would need to make this work. Because, if you think about it, at the time, we weren't this full service company like we are today. Like we weren't doing all of the full stack. We weren't owning everything. We were just a listing marketplace. I always say like AirGarage today is like if Airbnb came to your house and ran it like a hotel, that's what AirGarage is today. But at the time, we were just Airbnb, right?
Yeah, it was basically... you wouldn't even know this driveway was for sale unless you booked it from someone, so no one would park in it anyways.
Exactly. Yeah. So you had no idea. There was no signs. There was no maintenance. Like we just were a listing platform, right? And so we were providing a lot less value. So we were taking a lot smaller cut. And so, you'd list a driveway for $50 a month or something like that. We would make like $5 a month. And so at $5 a month per spot, you needed a lot of spots to make anything meaningful out of that revenue, right? Yeah. And that combined with door-to-door sales, which I thought was going to be maybe easier to do like marketing or flyers or like Facebook ads, we thought was going to be easier. And I also think that we thought that people understood the model or we're going to be more familiar with the model than they were. Like I remember this time I knock on this guy's door and I'm explaining this to him. I'm like kind of pitching him on like renting out his driveway. And I say the words, mistake, it's like Airbnb for your driveway. And he looks me dead in the eyes and he says, what's Airbnb? And I was just like, oh, I did not understand. Like, I'm in this like tech bubble even at this time before we had like moved to San Francisco. It's like, you have to think about like how much education you have to do in addition to the sale with a model like that to that consumer. Yeah. And so like the unit economics never would have made sense. And so there's sort of two precipitating events that led to us, shifting to what we do today. The first one was basically that we started talking to this church. And for context, we had a couple churches that were on the sort of driveway platform selling just monthly parking. So we were working with them already. And funny enough, one of those churches had asked us for a sign, basically, right? Like a sandwich board sign to put out in front of the church. And we were kind of like, not that into it. We were like, you might get shut down by the city if you put this sign out. Like, this is probably a bad idea.
Or you said that?
No, the church asked for the sign. We were saying like, we don't know if this is a good idea.
Yeah.
We eventually gave in and gave them the sign. And thank God, because like everything we built is based on this sign, in the sense that like that sign, somebody at another church that was actually like in the core of campus saw that sign right around the same time that I had basically stopped by their church to do a cold drop-in to try to sell to them. And so it was kind of those combination of those two events that we started talking to them about running their parking lot. And all they knew was like, AirGarage runs the other church's parking lot, so they must be able to run ours.
Yeah.
Yes. And we didn't do anything like that. It was like, this is hourly parking, transient rentals, like mixed use, like high volume. Like we were just doing monthly parking on the platform, not doing any of the operations at this point.
So there was like a miscommunication, but it worked in your favor.
Well,
basically.
Like some people would look at this harshly and be like, you scammed these people. And I'm like, no. We did customer discovery and we figured out what they needed and we built it for them. So like what would happen is like we had all these meetings and like we would go into these meetings at one end of the table and like the entire board of trustees for this church, like 15 people at this table, and they would just ask us for like hours, like all these questions, never ending questions of like, how are you going to manage, make sure that church guests get to park on Sundays and there's enough spaces? How are you going to make sure that they never get towed or ticketed? How are you going to charge people for parking? How are you going to advertise the spaces? How are you going to enforce the spaces? And, we would kind of come up with answers that seemed reasonable, explain that to them. And then if they were like, yeah, sounds good, we would go back and we would build that. And so thankfully they didn't ask to actually see the product before this because like it didn't exist. Because we wound up signing a contract with them basically May 15th of 2018. And then we went live in their parking lot June 1st of 2018. So like the foundations of everything that exists today for AirGarage like basically got built in like a couple of weeks by Scott, which is pretty amazing if you think about it, considering where we are today. But the other precipitating event that I sort of mentioned happened around the same time. I remember Scott, Chelsea, and I were sitting in a Potbelly sandwich shop in Tempe, kind of debating because we've been talking to this church about this parking lot, the First United Methodist Church in Tempe, just to make it clear, since I've mentioned a few different churches. So we're talking to FUMC Tempe about their parking lot, managing it, doing this hourly parking thing. And we also had the driveway business. And we're having this debate. And we're kind of like, well, if we have the driveway business and it's kind of like a sure thing, and like, we're going to scale this. We were going to take it from Tempe. We had done Tucson already, where University of Arizona was. We were going to do like 5 more universities. We're like, it's kind of working. Like, should we go all in on that, or should we do this other thing and like get distracted? Like, kind of classic pivot, discussion. And we weren't very sure. 2 things helped us. One, we basically hired this company to do door hangers at all of these 5 other universities across the country. And they just scammed us blind. Like, And so like, in retrospect, I'm like, thank God they did this. Because like, if they had actually put out the door hangers, like we probably would have thought like, oh, there's like wiggles of hope of growth. And like, this is working and like, let's keep doubling down on it. They just totally scammed us. Like they took like $6,000 from us, which we thought was like the entire amount of money in the world at the time, which it was a big sum to us at the time.
Because you had not raised any money.
No, we hadn't raised any money.
Okay.
So they took $6,000 from us to like put out these flyers, and they just didn't put any of them out. In retrospect, that's a good thing, but at the time it was devastating. But then around the same time, this church came online. And like we took over its parking lot for the first week. Like I'm sitting in their parking lot for the first week, like literally in their parking lot. It's June 1st of 2018. It's in Phoenix, so it's hot as hell.
Yeah. Did you have air conditioning in your car at least?
I know. I was just sitting on a folding chair in the parking lot. And it's like me and the parking attendant whose job we're taking, basically. He's being replaced he got moved into other parts of the church to do maintenance and stuff like that. But he's been the parking attendant, right? We're sitting there under an umbrella, just like absolutely baking in the asphalt in the sun. And like, I'm helping drivers. Like people are pulling up and I'm like, they used to just pay you $10 flat cash. You give them a little raffle ticket to denote that they paid. That was their whole system.
Yep, stick it in the window.
That was the whole thing.
Yep.
And so now I'm like, hey, you have to download an app. It's like this whole customer journey of like explaining this to people. Scott's back at the office, like things would break, like just fixing things on the fly. I'm like calling him every 5 minutes sort of thing. And I remember it was just amazing to me that we're sitting there in the parking lot. After a few days, it had slowed down and like people were in the system. It was stable and stuff. And the parking attendant, I was just like, man, this umbrella does a really good job of cooling you down under like better than sitting in the sun. He's like, yeah, I just got this. Like they only just bought this for me like 6 months ago. And I was like, you used to just sit out here in the heat? That's crazy. But yeah, so that was how we took over our first parking lot. And the revenue that it did was just so obviously more significant than what we were doing with the driveway business immediately. And so like that kind of solidified our decision that we were dropping out of school and actually moved to San Francisco. And so then we did that, took over our next parking lot July 1st of 2018, so the next month.
Was it in Arizona or was that in SF?
I was in Arizona. It was right across the street. So the first one was First United Methodist Church of Tempe. Across the street, Catholic Newman Center, which is another church. We took over their parking lot. Both of them just had very old school, self-managed operations, and then expanded to like 10 or 12 other locations around the university in the next 6 months or so.
Okay, so these were all like pretty obviously like, hey, people would pay for these because the university was there and it was like clear. And then I think I forget where you said this, but you were basically like, we moved to San Francisco and we were nobodies and we convinced people to invest in the company. How did that all happen? Why did you move to SF and would you recommend it to people?
I look back at this and I'm like, we were kind of crazy, like what we did, because like I mentioned, like Scott and I had this scholarship that was basically paying us to go to school, which is why we could afford to like spend time working on stuff like this. So forever grateful to them for taking a chance on us and like giving us that ability, because otherwise we would have been just working to pay for loans and things like that. So that was amazing. And so we decided in like January of 2018 that we were going to like basically drop out, which was, for the record, before we took over those parking lots. That was back in the driveway.
So this was still the driveway days.
Still the driveways. And in some ways, it's like kind of like cause and effect, right? So what we did was we kind of engineered it where we were like in class, independent study courses with certain professors. So we were still in class for the semester. So we could actually, but the professors were like on board with it basically being a seminar in entrepreneurship or whatever it was. And so then we just worked on the company full time for like that entire semester. And that was in some ways what led us to understand that the unit economics weren't going to work with the driveway model and to eventually build the thing for the churches and things like that. So it's kind of like cause and effect, because I'm like, we were kind of crazy to drop out at that point. Didn't make sense based on the driveway model. But if we hadn't dropped out, we would have found the better model. We probably just would have like stuck with the driveway thing and like not actually made any progress. So it's hard to say. And like people always ask me like, should we drop out? And I'm like, probably not. It's probably not a good idea. Like we did kind of crazily. But then so we moved to San Francisco, and the thought process there was we didn't want to stay in Tempe where all of our friends were still going to be going to school, going to class every day, kind of just being like, why are you guys doing this weird startup thing? Like, why aren't you going to class? Like, what are you doing with your days? And we were like, okay, well, we're going to move. So if we're going to move, we should probably move to the place that's the best place to start a startup. And Scott had been there because he was interning at Facebook for the summer while all of this was going on. And so he was already there, and he basically was like, hey, I found a house, like I'm signing a lease. let's move. You know, it was kind of that mindset of like, it was definitely like San Francisco was obviously still the best place to be for a startup at the time in 2018. I'm really glad that we did that, because everybody in like sort of these mid-tier startup hubs kind of like likes to talk about how they're the next Silicon Valley, right? Same thing in Phoenix. Like that was the case, was everybody was like, it's so happening here. But then like when you're in that and then you go to San Francisco, it's a
magnitude different.
It's
multiple
so
magnitudes.
It's just hard to understand without seeing it and understanding it and being part of it. And like a perfect example of that is like when we started fundraising, which was in spring of 2019. We really didn't basically know anybody, you know, in San Francisco for the most part. And so like a lot of the angel investors that I reached out to was just like a cold reach out. And so like I would just like DM people on Twitter that I had found, or I would like find people on Twitter and then email them. So a good example of this is like Ryan Delk was one of our first investors, and I found him on Twitter, I'm pretty sure. And then I emailed him at like 10 p.m. on like a Tuesday. And Ryan was like at the time the COO of a Series B company.
So he was doing Omni at the time?
Yeah, he was doing Omni at the time. You know, he has a family, he has kids, like. And at 10 p.m., he responded in like 5 minutes, immediately with like questions in the email thread. And we went back and forth, like rapid fire at like 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, really quickly. And like at a certain point, he's like, this is interesting. Do you want to come to my office at 7 a.m. tomorrow for coffee? And like, you know, if I'd been in Phoenix, like I never would have been able to be like,
chance,
I'll be there. But like I was in San Francisco. So I'm like, yeah, no problem. I'll go like meet up with you. And I think I went there and probably spent like an hour just like talking through everything with him. It's like, you know, we're so early stage. You just don't have a fully formed pitch at that time, but it's like you have this discussion with them, and like an angel investor is really betting on the founders, and like has this founder really thought through all of these edge cases that I can possibly address, and like are they thinking through this in a really deep way? And another random example of like an angel investor that we met in San Francisco is like Allison Barr-Allen. I think it was actually kind of a miscommunication where like I found her Twitter profile, and she like worked at Uber at the time, and like in her in her profile, I think she at the time said like equities investor or something like that. And I didn't realize that what she meant was like public equities. Like she was investing in, she was like passionate about investing in the stock market. So like I reached out to her thinking she was an angel investor, and she was aspiring to be an angel investor. I think at the time she wasn't yet. And so like I look back on that and I'm like, we were probably both like really nervous in that meeting because like I DM'd her on Twitter, sent her a deck, and like wound up meeting for coffee. She wound up investing. Yep. And I'm like, in retrospect, she was probably just as nervous as I was because I think she wasn't actually an angel investor at the time, but it worked out. And she's like one of our longtime investors and stuff like that. So it's like these random connections that you can make and like people that you can, meet and like immediately see in person and like build that connection is the reason that San Francisco is so valuable.
I'm just thinking through of like all the people I know invested, like you're not going to meet all those people in not San Francisco, a different hub. Maybe you could say New York. Maybe you could say LA. Maybe you could say Miami. Maybe the Founders Fund crew is listening.
Yeah, it's more about being part of the sort of the San Francisco tech bubble, right? And like if you're in that, you're getting the value. Starting the company in Phoenix, like I will be the first to admit that like I was the big advocate that like, oh, we can start the company in Phoenix. We don't need to be in San Francisco. Like why would we move? And Scott was like, no, you don't understand. Like we need to be in San Francisco. And thank God he said that because it's like, you pitch angel investors in Phoenix or any other sort of non-SF city. And it's like, they're usually like real estate or sort of like, had a business of their own, but they're like investing in a totally different paradigm than what the Silicon Valley SF VCs, angels are investing in.
Yeah. And they're like, what's the expected return? They want downside protection.
They want to see your 5-year financial projection, the meme of it. But like, it's wild.
Yeah. These are all good things to think about, but it's a little bit different in technology, startup investing versus real estate. They're different asset classes.
Right.
So you said this happened like the summer of 19.
So we moved to San Francisco August of 2018 and then raised our seed round, sort of started raising in the spring of 2019 and then closed the actual seed round in May of 2019.
Did much happen between that and COVID? I know COVID was interesting. Anything interesting between that?
2019 was mostly just like us figuring out how to run a business for the first time. I mean, Scott, Chelsea and I have basically not even like been employees at another company, right? Every day when we hire a new team member, like this is the biggest company that we've ever worked at, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. It's like, so as like a founder, you're the first time founder. I used to think when I was, when we were raising the seed round, like, oh, why do people make such a big deal about like, second time founders, like getting much better valuations and things like that. And I'm like, now I get it more so. It's like, there's just so many basic things that you learn just having done a lot of this. And like, we would definitely move a lot faster. It's like the history, like we kind of talked about the concept of like these eras before, but it's like 2019, we were actually really still focused on at the time, the thesis of like churches, small businesses, hotels, people that they have a parking lot and a garage, but it's not their main business, just trying to open up that underutilized real estate for them because like we'd had so much success with those first few churches and it was a really like low stakes way for us to run and learn how to run parking lots and garages, right? Because it's like, if you already are making a bunch of money with a traditional company, like why would you give us your parking lot? That was kind of what we thought. If we took you as a church from making $0 a month to making $10,000 a month and our system goes down for a day because we're a scrappy little startup, like you're not really going to complain that much because you didn't make any money before and now you're making a lot more. So it was kind of a low stakes environment for us to figure out how to run parking lots at scale across the nation. But then really the next thing that was interesting was mostly that COVID hit and our revenue dropped by like 90%.
Really? That's crazy.
March of 2020, yeah. And I look back on it and it's like COVID actually was net long-term a good thing for us in a lot of ways. But we were also just very fortunate in that we're a seed stage startup at the time. So
90% of revenue was like 100K or something.
Yeah, it's like 90% of revenue is not that much money. And it's sort of just like a reversion to the mean of like a seed stage startup in the sense that most seed stage startups don't have revenue anyway. And so it's like, okay, well, we had revenue. That was weird technically. And we're very fortunate that like if we were a small business, most small businesses only had like a few weeks worth of cash. And so like that's very unfortunate.
A couple of years on the balance sheet.
We had a lot of runway and we had been, I think, pretty frugal with the seed round and like sent consistent investor updates. And so like one of the first things that happened, actually, I respect them very much for this, is that Mike at Floodgate came to us and was like, hey, we don't know how long this is going to last. It could be the biggest freeze in venture basically since the .com bust. We'd like to give you more money so that you guys have at least this much runway to make sure that you make through this because like we don't want you guys dying just because of this. And I respect them a ton for that because it's like most people would probably looking from the outside, looking at a VC, not think that the VC would ever be coming to like a parking company in the pandemic and being like, hey, you should take more money because like we don't want you guys to like have to worry about runway during this time. Like you should just be focused on your customers and staying alive. It's like, that's a objectively bad bet for them to be making. Like, like in all senses of like any investment metrics or anything like that, terrible bet. That's what separates like a great investor like Mike and Floodgate from just people that are focused on returns.
I'm a big fan of Mike. That was actually, I think my first interview in VC was at Floodgate. Obviously, didn't get the job.
Worked out?
Yeah, it worked out. So what happened then after that during COVID? Like, I mean, you lost 90% of revenue. How'd you guys recover?
COVID was interesting as like a big opportunity for us in that like, we were so small at the time. It was bad to lose our revenue, but we talked about we had runway. We were fine.
Was it still just you three?
No. So we started hiring our first employees. Brian, our first employee who's still with us to today, started June 10th of 2019. So we had employees for like 6-ish months. Team was probably like 7 or 9 people at the time, like pretty small. A couple engineers, a couple salespeople, nothing fancy. Yeah, and so we had a small team. We had been conservative though, which I think helped with. It wasn't like we raised our seed round and immediately hired 50 people, and so the investors are like, I'm not going to give you more money. Like it's kind of a crazy thing to do. I think that helped, just being reasonable about how we were running the business. But what happened in COVID was we had always, like I said, been focused on the sort of churches, businesses, hotels, ancillary use cases. And we always wanted to move up market to sort of the tier 1 parking lots and parking garages that you think of when you think of a parking lot or a parking garage, the like downtown core urban assets.
Those are probably better like from a profitability,
they're
economic
better
standpoint.
All regards, right? Where it's like they understand why you should sell parking. So like with churches, you'd be surprised, like we were selling to them and basically pitching them like, hey, we're going to take you from making $0 to making $10,000 a month. And they're like, meh. Like maybe I'm not, it seems risky. And we're like, what do you mean it seems risky?
It's free money.
It's free money. And, it was kind of like pulling teeth selling to them, which was amazing to me because, I would explain it to someone like a third party and they'd be like, that sounds amazing. They must be signing up, left and right. And I'm like, well, no, they're not. And that's what's weird. And so like the thing is, you don't have to educate these real estate owners that own the tier 1 assets on like why they should sell parking. They're already selling parking. They just want to be doing it better and they want a good partner and they want to make more money and optimize it, right? And so you're just selling them on your solution instead of the general concept, which is nice. But what started happening in 2020 was basically that COVID was a much bigger blow to the traditional companies than it was to like a small, nimble company like us, right?
Yeah, so when you talk about the fixed lease fee,
exactly.
Instead of making 30K and you have to pay out 10, you're making close to 0.
Yes.
And you still got to pay out 10. Okay.
Exactly the problem. And like most of these companies, it's not like they're keeping a bunch of money on their balance sheet to be able to pay those. We collected the revenue for last month. We pay you this month's lease. Now we'll collect the revenue for this month and then we'll pay you next month's lease. Like it's like all float, right?
And some of them might have been publicly traded, paying out dividends and like compensating their shareholders, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It was a very painful time for a lot of these companies and for their employees and everything like that. And like obviously not wishing evil on them, but it was a convenient opportunity for us in that basically what started happening in like around April, May, when things started like people, kind of got over the initial freeze shock of COVID. There was actually basically this specific owner that came to us, I think through a Google ad in Omaha. She basically was like, look, I've been with this big publicly traded parking company for 20 years. We've had a good contract. We have had a good relationship. It was a lease. And so, they were paying her, say, like $8,000 a month every month, but the parking lot was making like 20. And she's like, they were happy to take all the upside when the times were good. And now they don't want to take the downside when the times are bad.
And they left her.
And so they stopped paying the lease. And she's like, that's not how a lease works. And so that's what we always tell real estate owners now too, is like, how sure are you that in the downtimes, this lease is actually going to pay you out? Because like, at least with us, you're still going to get 70% of the revenue, even if the revenue drops, right? So she came to us and that was kind of like an eye-opening experience because we always wanted to work with these types of people, but we never thought that they would switch from like a 100-year-old parking company that had been doing this for 20 years at their specific lot, that they would want to switch from them to us. We're like, we're just some dinky parking startup, right? Why would you want to work with us? So she was like, yeah, I'll hire you guys. And so we signed a contract on Thursday. Brian, our first employer, our head of operations now, and I flew to Omaha and put up the signs ourselves the following Monday because she was like, how fast can you get in here? Like a month and a half into COVID, back on planes, like just constantly going back and forth to Omaha.
Oh, I didn't think of that,
Yeah, and so like, it was crazy. The planes were all empty. It was so nice.
What were ticket prices like? Was it cheaper?
Dirt cheap, yeah. I mean,
really?
like we were off the planes, but Brian and I were traveling a lot before COVID, but then like back on the planes back in like late April 2019, 2020, sorry.
2020, okay.
And yeah, I mean, we just were back on flights back and forth to different cities because at the time we didn't have an operations team. We didn't have the ability to like sign on location. So like more often than not, we would just fly to places and put up the signs ourselves.
Yep.
Like I had a whole bag of tools that I would take on the plane with me. And like every time I would go through TSA, they would just like kind of go in and be like, well, I'm going to take this and that. And they're like, are you sure you want me to take these? And I'm like, well, yeah, just take it. Like, it's fine. They're like, you don't want to check it? I'm like, no, this happens every time. Like different TSA officers have different rules.
So they would like take your hammer or take your wrench or something. And you have to get a new one
when you landed. The technical rules, like I think it's 8 or 7 inches. Like any tool that's longer than that, you can't bring on the plane and stuff like that. There's all sorts of rules, but I didn't care. We were constantly buying new tools because we had this tool bag, but we were constantly flying around, signing on these locations. And so this owner basically opened our eyes to like, oh, like people will work with us. That's new and remarkable. And so we basically went all in on that. And so what we did was we reached out to like a bunch of other owners in Omaha that were working with the same company, basically called them and we were like, hey, is this company not paying your lease as well? And all of them were like, yeah, they just sent me a letter. They're not going to pay the lease anymore. And we signed on like 8 locations or something in like a month. And we were like, wait, this is crazy. Like this is a growth hack. The crazy thing is like that was all through like cold calling, not being there in person. And like previous to that, all of our sales had kind of been built around, We just didn't know how to do a cold call to real estate, didn't know how to figure out their information, didn't know how to find their phone numbers, didn't know how to find out who owned real estate, any of that.
Because it's
a
probably
lot of
the
work.
operator is the one that's listed versus finding out who actually controls the show.
If you're looking at like the signs on the street, that's all the operator. The owners of real estate typically are trying to hide, right? They're trying as hard as possible to make it so that you can't find them. And like our whole goal is like, we have to find you because we want to add value. So it's like this kind of game of cat and mouse. And so we had never figured that out before COVID. And so our whole strategy before that had been like, we would hire city launchers. They would be in a city and they would just show up in person to the like business or the church that we wanted to sell to and just like knock on the door and like sell you in person. And so we shifted our entire go-to-market motion to be around this like kind of cold calling outbound and building like a really solid data machine to figure out who these people are and getting their phone numbers and trying to reach out to them. And so we pivoted to all of that. And that led to basically us going all in on tier 1 parking lots and garages, these types of owners. And it was like the unlock was basically like taking this product and service that we'd already built and selling it to the right basically customer, where like they actually understood what we did. They actually understood the need for it. They actually wanted it versus the churches where it's kind of like pulling teeth. And that led us to grow basically like 12x year over year and then like grow into the Series A and wound up raising the Series A.
And that was kind of spring or summer of 21?
Series A was Q4 of 21.
Oh, Q4 of 21.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And that was Sriram at A16Z?
Yeah, Shroom at A16Z.
How do you recommend a founder that's trying to do that? How should they approach raising a Series A?
The advice for the Series A and the seed round are pretty similar in the sense of like, I think being very diligent and running a process is the most important thing. The sort of canonical advice is that VCs will sort of string you along because like it's their job. Like they have all day and all the time in the world, technically or theoretically, to be able to talk to people that are founders, right?
Yep.
And as a founder, you don't have all day or all the time in the world. Like you have a runway and you have a deadline and you have growth goals that you have to hit. Running a process is the most important thing. I think that building a relationship with the investor beforehand is the best thing to do because then when you get into the process, then you already are familiar with them. Because I think that there was like investors that we reached out to as part of our Series A process that just saw like parking and were like immediately no. But if I had like built a relationship with them beforehand and explained sort of all of the things that we've talked to today, you know, about why it's such an interesting problem and why it can be a massive opportunity, maybe they would have at least had a conversation, especially if you're in like a weird, unsexy market. We're not B2B SaaS. We're not an AI company.
You weren't crypto. I'm thinking about 21. You weren't crypto.
We did not have a coin. We thought about, no, just kidding. So it's like if you're not a sexy, you know, hot market startup, first of all, good for you. But then secondly, you know, you just have to like work harder at building that relationship and getting people to understand the deeper, because it's like everybody has to operate on these mental models and sort of like pattern matching. And like, that's just how we have to live our lives and do shortcutting to get through the day, right? So I think it's about building a process and running that process effectively. But then like before that process, making sure that you've sort of curated the list of like folks that you're excited about working with so that then when you run that process, they already kind of are primed about who you are and what you do. So they don't immediately say, nah, I'm not interested in parking, right? Because who is?
So when you say process, can you give us a high level of what a process should look like?
Yeah, I mean, so at our Series A, we had one investor that was kind of like helping quarterback our fundraise in a sense. So
was this Rampton and Abstract?
Was Rampton and Abstract.
Okay.
I assume he's okay with us talking about this. I have no idea.
No, it's just every time I've co-invested with him, it's all he does a really good job at that.
That's kind of his whole pitch at the seed round was basically like the way we're gonna, we got introduced to him by Founders Fund, and then they invested in our seed round, Abstracted. And his whole pitch was basically like, I'm going to help raise your Series A because I'm, very connected. And that's a pretty interesting, enticing pitch as a seed stage founder, right?
I believe it too, because I think I've just seen him do it a lot.
I think he has a good success rate, and I don't know the sort of behind the scenes magic of what he's doing on the back end to make it work, but it does work. And like he introduced us to like 35 firms all on like the same day. That's part of it. And that's what it is about the process is like, he's just sending a lot of intro emails and trying to have as many intro calls, trying to run a process. And same thing with like hiring, very process oriented on hiring. How do you get as much top of funnel? How do you be very systematic about this whole thing?
Because you want to make sure at the end of the day, you go through this process, you want to make sure you have a result at the end.
Yes.
So 10 conversations or 35 or 50, as many as you can squeeze in. Maybe 100 is too much, or maybe 50 is good. It's 5 times more conversations than just 10. There's just a higher percentage that at the end of the day, you will convert on the objective, whatever it is.
One of the best lines that I've heard from a later stage founder was like, you only need one. You only need one candidate for the role that you're trying to fill. You only need one term sheet for the round that you're trying to do. You only need one. And so like just optimize for getting one, because like you don't need, at our seed round, we had like 5 term sheets, right? But like, what did I do with the other 4 term sheets? Nothing. they're useless. They're meaningless now at this stage, right? Like we only needed the one from Floodgate. It's not a good optimization to be optimizing for like, how do we make sure that we have, multiple term sheets and like multiple candidates and things like that. It's a waste of energy, right? It's like you only need one. And so, he basically introduced like meet 35 firms, try to like get as many of them to say yes as possible. We're a parking company, so like naturally some of them are just like, this isn't really a space that we're interested in. I get it, and then basically they're just like back-to-back meetings for like 2 or 3 days, just intro meetings with folks. I actually think that one of the things I regret about our Series A is that like my natural pitch style is very much like this conversational thing. And that's what we did at the seed round. And it worked really well. Like send you the deck ahead of time. And like basically, I assume you've read the deck and now let's just talk through things. And that's just what I'm really comfortable with, my natural style. And I think that like I over-indexed on some founders that I really respect giving me the advice, which I'm glad that they did, not saying they were wrong, but like they gave me the advice of like, you have to have a deck and present a deck for a Series A. And I think that that's not true. Like, I think that I maybe misinterpreted their advice and they maybe meant in like a partner meeting or something like that. But I regret doing that because it's like, it wasn't my natural pitch style. So I don't think that was as good as it could have been. But then basically just like from there, once you have your first meeting with folks in the Series A, especially in 2021, it's like, pretty quickly if they're interested or not.
So it's like different now, but
it's very different now, I'm sure. But, so like I wouldn't, if I was a founder listening to this, I wouldn't over-index on like this process that we ran because it may not be, or it probably isn't the right process to run for your company, for what you're building, for who you are as a founder. But basically the timeline for Andreessen Horowitz, I met them at first on a Monday. So I'd met most firms like Thursday, Friday, met them on a Monday. And what I liked about Andreessen Horowitz was that on the first call, they had the entire partner team of like investors for this specific vertical.
This is consumer team?
This was the consumer team for Andreessen Horowitz. And so their entire team was on the call. And this was my best pitch call because like it was just no deck, just them rapid fire from all directions asking me questions, which I've always loved. I mean, all the way back to that trustees meeting with the church back in the day. It's like, that's just my like natural style of like presenting. And so that went really well. Immediately texted with Shroom right afterwards, which is always a good sign. And then we met up for coffee the next morning, continued the conversation. They requested data like Wednesday, Thursday, dug into the data, and then had like some Zooms like Friday night because of like someone back channeling to like Mark Andreessen and like, all the things that you do to like move fundraise forward. And then had very classic A16Z, had dinner with them Sunday. And we negotiated live during the dinner because that's what they like to do.
Interesting. Okay.
And then, signed a term sheet that night. So it was like less than a week.
Process.
That's but a classic 2021.
Yeah, but that also, it wasn't just a week as in one touch point and you 30-minute Zoom and they sent an email. It sounds like there's many touch points.
A lot of touch points.
And there's a lot of people too. So it wasn't like they were just like on a whim.
We talked like every day for the entire week. Like we were on conversations with at least one of them every day, back and forth via email the entire time. And that's where like you have to be, when I say running a process, part of it is like managing your time on your end. Like during this time, I was to the rest of the company effectively a dead body. I'm not involved in anything. Like all I'm doing is responding to and triaging data requests from different teams. And like there was a few firms that like dug in pretty deeply on the data and stuff like that. But Andreessen Horowitz wound up moving the fastest and they were the partner that we were excited about.
So how did you decide who you want to work with?
There's a few different things, but similar for the seed round and for the Series A. Both of the firms or both of the partners that we talked to basically sort of like independently had theses that aligned with our vision for the future, right? And so when it was the seed round, it was kind of interesting, like it was peak autonomous vehicle hype in 2018, 2019, right? Sort of in the very beginning of the like hype wave where like autonomous vehicles had just become, and like, this is actually a funny story. I'll look forward to telling him this in person someday, but one time at a pitch event in 2018, right after we had moved to San Francisco, we were at the launch event hosted by Jason Calacanis, right? Okay. And they had like anybody could get on stage and like basically pitch. I get on stage, I do the pitch, and it's like a little competition. There's like 5 people on stage, and then Jason Calacanis gives you feedback. His feedback was basically like, give up on this business immediately.
Because autonomous vehicles are coming.
He was like, autonomous vehicles are going to be everywhere next year, the year after, just in the JCal like cell. Next year, the year after, like everywhere. Everybody's going to be in autonomous vehicles. You should give up on this immediately. This is a terrible idea. Go work on something else. And I look forward to the day that like I can just be like, meet Jason Calacanis again someday and be like, well, it didn't happen as fast as you. I mean, still someday. I ride in cruises all the time in San Francisco. Still someday. But anyway, Floodgate had this thesis around this because they were involved in Lyft in the early days, and Anne was on the board at Lyft. I don't know, she might still be. They basically were thinking about like what happens to real estate in cities and cars and transportation if autonomous vehicles become as common as we expect them to. Their thesis around like there's something there and like it requires a system of record and requires data and knowledge about what's going on currently to be able to adapt to that and optimize was basically in line with what we were thinking at the time as well. So that was like why we chose them. And then like A16Z sort of had this like Shriram basically had this good line at the time of like, if you think about parking 10 years from now, there's basically no way in which you can imagine that parking 10 years from now will still look like it does today. And so if that's true, you should be wanting to bet on some horse in this race. And they had looked at other companies in the space, and they basically were like, we really like the founders and this sort of story and hustle and pivots and stuff that we had to go through to get to that point. So like them being bought into that was really what sold us on them. And then also I think Andreessen Horowitz as a firm, it's hard to overstate how valuable the brand is, because like most VC firms, people outside of Silicon Valley have never heard of. And so if you're recruiting within Silicon Valley, that's fine. But a lot of our employees have never worked at a tech startup before. They're based in cities, all over the country. They're not from here. And we're selling to real estate owners who are not from the Silicon Valley bubble. They've never heard of, Sequoia. They've never heard of Floodgate. They've never heard of Founders Fund, but they have heard of Andreessen Horowitz, which is pretty damn impressive, if I do say so myself. Like, the fact that all these random people, these random employees that we're hiring, random, real estate owners, they've heard of Andreessen Horowitz is immensely valuable and like very impressive.
They're very good at PR, and I've seen co-investing. I've seen how valuable that can be. I'm also good friends with Sriram too. So
cool.
So he specifically said, make sure you talk about the hustle early days.
Yes.
Sitting out in the sun, which we did. I want to give him a shout out for that question.
Yeah.
The future of AirGarage, what does it look like? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but like I'm thinking 5-10 years. Sounds like, Sriram had a little bit of a thesis around this. What does it look like?
Near term, it's a lot about just like how do you continue to improve this technology stack, because there's like kind of this flywheel that you can get into, and like you have to kickstart the flywheel through sales. It's basically a question of like, okay, you get more locations, that gives you more resources to invest in the best technology. You have the best technology that drives better returns for us, means our margins are better. So we have more to invest in sales and product and stuff like that. But then it also drives better returns for owners, which means all of that leads to more parking lots, right? In this kind of continuous feedback loop. And then there's also sort of this separate feedback loop on the consumer side, which Sriram was really excited about like, you make it so that consumers prefer AirGarage locations. They therefore go to your locations, you drive better returns, and then you can show that to owners and get more locations as a result of that sort of thing. But, that's all like more near term than long term. I think in the long term, like what we think about a lot at AirGarage is back to this question of like how cities function and operate, and like, the fact that 30% of the city is parking, and that you can optimize that. And if you wanted to start a tech startup in like 2005, you basically needed to go and like buy servers and like rack them in your dorm room, right? And today, or like in 2018 when we were getting started, instead you just tap into an API, you spin up an S3 instance with AWS, and like you can scale up and scale down. You can infinitely scale immediately, right? And because of that, like more people can start companies, right? And when we think about like anything that exists in the physical world today, it's like effectively in the like racking servers in your dorm room era of building things in the physical world, in the world of atoms instead of the world of bits, right? If you want to start a little like jewelry shop or a bakery shop or something like that, you need to go find a broker. You need to go through this long process. You need to sign a multi-year lease and put down a big deposit and commit to all this stuff up front, even if you don't know if people are going to buy your goods, right? Our whole thesis is like, okay, if you can create this digital system of record for parking for the first time, and this real estate in cities for the first time, then you can start to move toward more of like the AWS scale up and scale down your real estate use on demand. So we have this arm of the business that's basically like enterprise use cases of AirGarage. So it's like farmers markets, food truck parks, studios for movies that use our locations, rental car fleets, all these sort of things that need to be able to reallocate their use of real estate in cities on demand. And they should be able to do that. You shouldn't have to commit to a multi-year lease when you don't necessarily know if it's going to work out. You shouldn't have to work with a broker to find this space. You should just be able to see this 30% of the city and see how and when and where and why it's being used, and then be able to scale up and scale down your usage on demand. And so that's like where we think things are going, is like, if you can create that system of record, it creates a lot of value and unlocks a lot of value in this real estate, and makes it easier for people that want to build things in the physical world. Because if you think about Zipcar, got started in 2005. How did they have to do that? They had to go and like just knock on individual businesses' doors and ask to lease parking spots from them. Very manual process. And with AirGarage in the future, they could just, and they do, tap into our network, scale up and scale down on demand, rent spaces from us anywhere across the country.
And actually, I had a friend who had a really interesting thesis. His name is Michael Naka. It's almost like Google search or AdWords for a physical space. So like, let's say you have a truck and you wanted to unload in New York, you're parking blocking the street or something, or you can almost like facilitate and rent on demand, on the fly, different spaces, not even in a parking lot, but even on the side of the street, like while you're unloading.
What was the name of the company?
It's not really a company.
Oh, gotcha.
It's like this concept that he kind of has, like, what if that exists at some point? So it's like, if you're FedEx dropping off a package, you paid 30 cents to be on the street for 5 minutes to unload. That will incentivize you as the FedEx driver to get in and get out and not block the street. And maybe the city makes more money too. Like the city can generate revenue from the roads, versus right now, there's no revenue, there's no data. They're mostly insolvent, and they continue to issue debt to keep it going. and hope that the city grows, which is not really happening in a lot of cases. So we're at an interesting point in kind of cities and how they're evolving. So different podcast topic, most likely. So I usually do rapid fire. Do you have a favorite founder or CEO or business that you've like learned a lot from, really look up to? Can be current, historical, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, maybe a good like a historical answer is like I really love everything about Sam Walton and like what he did at Walmart, and like Made in America is one of the best books that I've ever read. It's just like really impressive what they did with so little, and like it was all like personal debt that he was issuing before they IPO'd, and like getting started. And it's just goes to show that you don't need a massive amount of capital to make something if the economics are working, right? And so we've always been very focused on unit economics and like treating the customer right and all these sort of things. And I think that's something that he really leans into. Maybe more of like a modern example, which is also funny. Ryan Peterson at Flexport, he's one of our angel investors. I met him because right after the seed round, I basically was like looking for angels to get into the round, and Mike Maples was able to like source a connection to him, which was impressive to me at the time because I was nobody, and Mike Maples just made it happen in like 5 minutes, which was awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Very cool benefit of working with connected people. And then I went over to Ryan, was basically like, come over to my house, I'm having a dinner. And so I show up and it's like me and they probably don't remember this, but it's me, Austin Allred from Lambda School. Well, now
Bloom.
Sean McGuire from Sequoia was there. It was just kind of funny because like I show up to this dinner, don't know who's going to be there, don't know any of the context, and I thought it's just me pitching Ryan, and like I basically wound up being like the entertainment for the night, where like they were just like having me pitch live at this dinner and like just digging into all the details of like the Space Force and stuff that.
I should have asked Sean about this.
Yeah, that would have been funny. I haven't talked to Sean in a little while, but and so then the funny thing is I was just hanging out with Ryan Peterson a little while ago, just catching up, all that sort of stuff. And, I mentioned like, I think there's some similarities between AirGarage and Flexport. And he's like, no, there's not. I was just like, what? They were both full stack businesses doing like tech enabled service. But, I just thought that was so funny.
Yeah.
But, to him, like it's like the multi-billion-dollar company. Like, of course, they don't seem similar in any way, shape or form, which I get. So, but definitely look up to them.
When you are hiring, do you have a favorite go-to interview question?
Yeah, definitely. The thing that I most like to ask and like get the answer to is basically like, what's something outside of work that you consider yourself an expert in? And this winds up going so many different ways, but it tells you a lot about the person. Is it that they've been playing piano for their entire life? Or is it that like they recently took up like a gardening hobby? Everybody has a different definition of what an expert is or what is not an expert. And I think it just reveals a lot of like someone's passion and drive of like, are they outside of work doing things that just interest them? We just like to hire interesting people that are interested and interesting and, want to have these different topics and passions and things like that. It's just so boring if like you just only are like just purely an engineer who doesn't do anything else, doesn't think about anything else. I think pretty much everybody at the company like has things outside of work that they're passionate about. And I like having people like that because it's like generally those people are also like A players that are A players at work and in their personal life. So that's I think the biggest thing that we look for.
I think I've also heard the answer to that question is figure out what they're really good at, and you can go really deep on them and see how good they can get at something. So it can be like, okay, this person's like really good. I think one of the previous guests of the show, Adrian Ayun at Forward Health, was like, I met somebody, she was just an expert on sharks, I think. And he's like, she went way deeper on sharks than I thought.
Yeah.
Obviously, she's smart. She can do the same thing with healthcare.
Right.
So you can kind of say like, okay, this person's very, very knowledgeable at this one thing, like can translate to being super good at their job. Maybe. I mean, that's what you would hope.
Generally, yeah. I think that's true. It's like people that are like weirdly obsessive and like I spent so much time as a kid just like reading Wikipedia articles, and I still do. It's like, I don't care about this topic, but like I was reading a Wikipedia article about like Detroit the other day, actually, and the history of Detroit. And I'm like, okay, like why am I reading this? I don't know, but like it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good one. The Detroit specifically.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorites is it's like a history of all recessions or bank failures in the United States.
Yeah. It's like, is that the book you mean, or is it the Wikipedia?
Wikipedia article.
Really? Because there's a book that's like a history of the United States in like 7 recessions or something like that, or 7 crashes or something.
Something. I mean, they're probably the same topics, but it's just super interesting. Like it's all the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
People get over leveraged. There's some kind of an external shock no one was predicting. That's why they fail.
Exactly.
TLDR. I mean, there's a nuance to it, but it's always the same. It's like history never repeats, but it always rhymes. So one last question I've been asking a lot lately. Do you have any questions for me at all on anything?
Why did you choose the name Banana Capital?
Have you ever tried to name a company?
Like me naming the company?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like you probably not, everything was taken, right?
Yeah.
So it actually happened because my wife was like, we probably spent a total of 8 hours over the course of like a month in our free time. We spent 30 minutes, thought of all these names. Apple is the most valuable company in the world. It's a fruit. So I was like, fruit. There's not very many venture firms named after fruit, not very many investment firms. And that's the thing too, when you're trying to come up with the name of an investment firm, there's like real estate, tons of them, hedge funds, there's a bunch. There's not quite as many venture firms. There's a lot. Very few fruit names that were taken. So the list was pretty long of like the options to choose from. I just think banana is kind of funny. It's disarming. It's also a word. It can be serious, right? Like Apple, it's the most valuable company in the world. Why not? Also, when you think about just the way bananas work, they are sort of like startups where most bananas are like clones of other bananas. And typically this doesn't happen all the time, but you will have a disease, like one of them will get sick and will wipe off the whole field, the whole crops, the entire plantation of bananas, which this happens all the time with startups. It's also I think it's the most consumed food in the world, or fruit. And I think it's Walmart's number one selling item globally is bananas. So there's some meaning behind it, but also it was just a name. It wasn't taken. I thought emojis are really important too. I think about that a lot in like marketing and branding. It's like banana, it's an emoji.
It's a very good emoji. Like I mean, when I was making my notes for this podcast, it's like banana emoji immediately on the top of the Notion doc. It's so brandable. It's amazing. Everybody has your emoji built in.
Branding at AirGarage, and you kind of mentioned it. Why do you think it's important? You're a parking company. Why is branding important?
In some ways, I think that's why it's important, is because like nobody else in the industry like really pays attention to it, right? We talked about maybe at some point earlier is like pretty much every other parking company in America is blue, red, or black. We're the only orange parking company. So immediately we stand out against the crowd. And like we've paid a ton of attention and put a lot of thought into like how do we make our signs as simple and clear as possible, because we want people to be able to pay. We want it to be simple and easy to pay. And we basically have this philosophy that like the easier you make it and the simpler you make it, like the more people will pay. That's better for us. That's better for real estate owners. And the brand comes down to like just making people have like simple delights as they're like having your experience. And like if you do that enough times, like people are going to remember it and want to come back. And I guess one other question is like, can you name any other parking companies? How many parking companies have you tweeted about and been like, I found one? So it's like, true. There's value in a brand that I think most parking companies just don't really pay attention to, because they mostly, I think that a lot of people in the industry like kind of see the consumer as like the enemy for a lot of history. And like, I think that that's the wrong mindset. And like, we want to have a positive, good value add relationship with the consumer, the driver that's parking in the lot, because that's a win-win-win for us, for the owner, for the driver. And I think that a lot of the companies, it's basically like their customer support channel is basically just like a war zone with the drivers and like basically back and forth with them about tickets and towing and bad experiences and stuff like this. And it's like, we want that to be a happy place. And like, we want AirGarage's brand to be a happy brand. And that's why like, even like the little car in the logos, we call him Sparky, the little car in the logo. I don't think I've ever said that publicly. So you just got some new info. He's like, has like a little subtle smile on his face, right? It's like just a happy brand. It's really just about like, how do you make something that's delightful? And like, we want to create a delightful experience, make it a good experience. And like, just nobody else in the industry does, which is why it's so much more important to like have that brand.
If you've been to an AirGarage, you know the experience. You're going back, you're finding parking, multiple lots. Location is important, but probably only to a certain degree. And it's like, had a good experience at this one, terrible experience at that one across the street. Why would I go back there? Like, I'm going to go to the one that I just know it's nice, I can find a spot, easy. I know I can get in and out simply. I'm not going to get overcharged. Yes. They're not going to tow my car.
The goal is like if we have two locations that are equivalent and you can choose between the AirGarage location and the other location, in the traditional world, you would have been basically ambivalent between, or I don't know if that's the right word, but you would have been indifferent between the two locations that were available to you. But in our world, you see the AirGarage, you see the orange, and you're like, oh, I would prefer to park there. And that becomes sort of a virtuous flywheel where then the other parking garage now wants to work with AirGarage because people want to park with AirGarage, and therefore we get more supply, more demand, and kind of a virtuous feedback loop.
The revenue from the business comes from consumers willing to park in a lot. If you're selling to the landlords, to the lot owners, but they don't actually make the money. Like the consumer is one that's actually transacting and paying. Yeah,
and you can't forget sight of that. Like, I mean, there's locations that we talk to, and like basically the way that they're managing it is kind of just like in the business of scamming people. And I'm like, this short term is probably making you more money, but it's like going to hurt your business in the long run because, there's all these reviews. People are upset about the tickets because there's no grace period, because they, made a simple typo, because they forgot to pay, like all these reasons. And you're just being like heavy-handed. And like in the short term, that's making you more money. But in the long run, it's going to harm the total value of your asset because you have these tenants that are businesses, they're not going to want to be here anymore if you're treating the drivers poorly. Like that's a very important relationship. And you know, it's kind of a classic. You don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, right? You don't want to like optimize the revenue of the parking lot by scamming people and then lose your tenants or lose the customers and make people not want to come back. So I think the brand goes into that of like, if you can create a positive experience, it becomes part of the flywheel. I
know you've got a board meeting you got to leave to, like right now. This is actually a common theme on the podcast. For whatever reason, we keep scheduling them before board meetings. But this is awesome. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, send this episode to a friend who owns a parking lot but doesn't use AirGarage to manage it yet. If you don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to the newsletter, The Split, in the description, and you'll get new ones in your inbox. Thanks again to Jonathon for coming on and to Secureframe for supporting the show. I hope you learned something new. We'll see you next time.